On August 1st, 1937, doctors at Memorial Hospital in Colorado Springs contacted local authorities regarding the patient's sudden and mysterious death. The victim, 67-year-old George Obendorfer, had fallen inexplainably ill just days earlier. Doctors could not determine what had made him sick, and their best efforts had not been enough to save him. After interviewing staff members at the hospital, investigators discovered Obendorfer had been visiting the area and his primary residence was in Cincinnati, Ohio. The elderly man, along with two unknown companions, checked into the Park Hotel on July 30th, 1937. Colorado authorities found the circumstances intriguing because the hotel owner had just filed a report regarding $300 worth of stolen diamonds. Investigators now wanted to determine whether the two incidents were related. Shortly after arriving at the Park Hotel, investigators learned that Obendorfer had registered there with a woman named Anna Marie Hahn and her young son, Oscar. According to the hotel owner, Mrs. Hahn had informed him she lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, and was in Colorado on vacation. A quick check of the room revealed no clues, and Mrs. Hahn and her son were nowhere to be found. In an attempt to determine whether the jewels and Mr. Obendorfer's premature death were related, investigators began visiting local pawn shops with the hope that the thief might have tried to sell the diamonds. It was not long before their efforts paid off. One local shop owner informed them that a woman, who was accompanied by a young boy, had tried to pawn similar jewels, but the owner had decided not to purchase them. His description of the woman matched the hotel owner's description of Anna Hahn. As Colorado authorities broadened their search for Hahn, they learned that a woman fitting her description had tried to withdraw $1,000 from a Denver bank using a Cincinnati bank book in the name of George Obendorfer. Even though the woman claimed to be Mrs. George Obendorfer, the bank manager, sensing something was not right, refused to make the transaction. Detectives were convinced the woman in question was Anna Hahn. Investigators wasted little time securing an arrest warrant for Hahn for suspicion of grand larceny in the theft of the hotel jewelry. Suspecting she had fled the area and returned to Ohio, investigators contacted Cincinnati authorities for assistance. It was soon learned Hahn had returned home, and Cincinnati investigators promptly picked her up. When asked by Colorado investigators what she knew about George Obendorfer's death, Anna responded, "The man is a perfect stranger to me." However, when reminded she had signed the hotel registry book for Obendorfer herself and her son, Anna changed her tune. "I met him on the train from Denver," she said. "He was Swiss. I felt sorry for him and was only trying to help him." Both teams of investigators knew Obendorfer was from Cincinnati and doubted Anna's story. Luckily for investigators, several of George's relatives lived in the area and were able to shed some light on the situation. Through interviews with his family, investigators learned George had immigrated to Ohio from Russia years earlier. A retired shoemaker and father of three, George had recently separated from his wife. Family members were also shocked by his sudden death, stating he had been in excellent health. Nonetheless, more telling was one family member's revelation that Anna had known George and the two had been dating. The trip was, according to the relative, Anna's idea, and George had gone along under the premise they were going to visit a ranch she owned in Colorado Springs. Confronted with this new evidence, Anna admitted to detectives that she knew George Obendorfer. She claimed to have met him weeks before in a local shoe shop, but denied the two had been involved in a recent relationship. Instead, she reverted back to her original story. Anna claimed it was by chance she had met George on the train, and they were coincidentally going to vacation to the same place. According to Anna, she and George got along well during the trip and ultimately decided to share a room once they reached their mutual destination in Colorado Springs. However, shortly after arriving and registering at the hotel, George became ill and went to the hospital. Anna claimed to have no further contact with him after that. Investigators continued to doubt Anna's claims and decided to look further into her background for answers. Through continuing interviews with the suspected thief and possible murderer, investigators learned that Anna was a German native, born in 1906, and had emigrated to Cincinnati in 1929 at the age of 23. Before coming to the United States, she had married a doctor from Vienna, and the couple had a child, Oscar. Not long after their son's birth, the family immigrated together, but the doctor died shortly after they arrived in the States. Both the Cincinnati Post and the Cincinnati Enquirer obtained several Anna police interview transcripts, which they both published several times during the investigation. According to those accounts, Anna had an aunt and uncle in Cincinnati's German district, so she decided to stay in the country and make a new start. During a community dance at the Hotel Alms, Anna met a telegraph operator named Philip Hahn. The couple quickly fell in love and eventually wed. Philip desperately wanted to leave his job, so the couple saved their money and finally opened 2 delicatessens. Shortly after that, Anna's aunt and uncle died and left her their home on 2970 Coleraine Avenue. Investigators soon learned that while Anna's marriage to Philip may have appeared solid to outsiders, the young couple had their share of problems, most of which seemed to have revolved around Anna's hunger for money. Anna seemed to tire quickly of her duties operating one of the couple's delicatessens and opted to work on various money-making schemes. Arson was Anna's first choice, as there were 3 suspicious fires on the books, the first of which occurred at one of the delicatessens, located at 3007 Coleraine Avenue. While the fire caused minimal damage, Anna still managed to collect $300 from the insurance company. The other 2 fires both took place at the Hahn residence, the first on June 2, 1935, and the second on May 20, 1936. Anna collected just over $2,000 for both fires. Regardless of her suspected taste for fire, one of Anna's presumed schemes might have required a death of her husband, albeit by mere accident or brutal intent. On 2 separate occasions, Anna tried to secure a $25,000 life insurance policy on her husband, but she met resistance from him each time. Whether it was a simple superstition or the fear of losing his life is unknown. Regardless, what is known is that shortly after that, Philip Hahn became severely ill and, against Anna's wishes, was taken to the hospital by his mother. Although Philip survived his mysterious illness, the marriage continued to suffer and the couple eventually separated. After falling out with her husband, and despite her lack of training or experience in the field, Anna began working as a visiting nurse for elderly patients. It was perhaps this revelation that made investigators decide to follow up with several of her previous patients. Cincinnati investigators were shocked when they discovered that a separate case, the mysterious death of 78-year-old Jacob Wagner, had ties to Anna Hahn. Whether by accident or through unconscious remorse, Anna told investigators she cared for Wagner while working as a visiting nurse. The German native and retired gardener had mysteriously died 2 months earlier, and in his final will, he left his entire estate to Anna Hahn. While the coroner's report listed heart disease as the cause of death, a suspicious friend had been badgering police to investigate, and an exhumation had just been granted to autopsy Wagner's remains. As investigators began putting the pieces together, they decided to visit Wagner's neighborhood. They soon learned that Anna had approached Wagner and claimed to have been a long-lost niece. The elderly man knew he had no living relatives and balked at her claim, but soon relented and allowed her to help him with his day-to-day chores. Neighbors also claimed that Hahn had spent several hours in Wagner's apartment after his death. Investigators soon met Olive Luella Kohler, an elderly woman that lived in the same apartment building as Wagner. They learned that Anna had befriended the woman and had brought her ice cream cone treats on at least 2 occasions. However, after eating the second cone, Mrs. Kohler became violently ill and was admitted to the hospital. While the police almost immediately became suspicious, it is unknown whether or not the elderly Mrs. Kohler herself ever connected the ice cream with her illness. Regardless, during her stay in the hospital, someone did steal a bag from her residence, which contained an unknown amount of cash and jewelry. It did not take long for investigators' suspicions to reach the media, which immediately published several stories about Hahn possibly poisoning elderly patients. While most of the initial reports were exaggerated and full of errors, they provided the police with several promising leads. One of those came from 62-year-old George Hess. According to Hess, he had met Anna Hahn a year earlier. While the two appeared to get along initially, Hess claimed to have become suspicious of Anna when he became violently ill after drinking a mug of beer she poured for him. While he had since never felt like he was in good health, it was only after seeing reports in the newspaper that he decided to come forward with his story. Investigators were beginning to fear that Anna was poisoning her elderly patients for money. When they learned of yet another mysterious death in which Anna was acquainted with the victim, they launched yet another investigation. On July 6, 1937, just weeks before Anna's trip to Colorado, another one of her patients, 67-year-old George Zellman, died in his room at 1717 Elm Street. Friends of the Zellmans told authorities he had become suddenly ill after his last visit with Anna and died shortly afterward. Investigators worked quickly to secure an order for exhumation and autopsy, which they were immediately granted. In the coroner's preliminary examination of George Zellman, he discovered a metallic poison in the body. The substance was initially thought to be arsenic. Still, upon conducting further tests, it was found to be croton oil, a general household remedy used during the turn of the century. While the drug is usually not fatal in small doses, a large amount could quickly kill. Stedman's Medical Dictionary states that the drug could cause intense burning pain in the mouth, throat, abdomen, excessive salivation, vomiting, and diarrhea, with tenseness and blood passage. In other words, anyone taking a large dose of the drug would meet a ruthless and bitter end. As investigators worked to gather their evidence, Philip Hahn came forward and gave them a half-ounce bottle of croton oil he had taken away from his wife when the two lived together. Upon investigating the effects of the drug, Philip had taken the bottle to work and hid it in a locker, suspecting that his wife had used it to poison him. "I kept intending to turn it over to the police," he told the Cincinnati Post during a September 1937 interview. A pharmacist at a drugstore in North College Hill later confirmed that Anna purchased the oil on July 20, 1936. The druggist knew Anna personally and said she had told him her husband was a German druggist who used the oil in his practice. Because of her Colorado warrant, Anna continued to be detained by Cincinnati authorities. While Colorado may have wanted to arrest her for theft and question her about George Obendorfer's untimely death, Ohio was beginning to make their case, and they were not about to let her go. Not yet, anyway. During a search of Anna's home, investigators found a promissory note for $2,000, money she had borrowed from someone named Albert Palmer. During a follow-up investigation on the note, investigators learned that Albert Palmer was a 72-year-old resident of 2416 Central Parkway. However, upon paying a visit to Palmer's home, they were informed by relatives he had died on March 27, 1936, after having been ill for an extended period. It was also revealed that Anna Hahn had been caring for the man before his death. Relatives also informed investigators that at least $4,000 was missing from Palmer's estate. Ohio authorities were getting more than they had bargained for, and their suspicions turned to allegations when the results of Jacob Wagner's autopsy came back. While they found no trace of croton oil in his system, they did discover large quantities of arsenic, an all-too-common poison used by murderers then and now. Investigators decided to question Anna's son, Oscar, hoping that he might be able to provide them with some answers. While the young boy knew nothing of his mother's patients, he did tell them that, contrary to his mother's statements, they had met George Obendorfer by chance at the train station. She had purchased his ticket at Union Terminal in Cincinnati. Oscar also informed them that his mother had served Obendorfer several drinks on the train and that the man began feeling ill before they arrived in Colorado. Deciding to move on Anna before her extradition to Colorado, Ohio authorities arrested her on August 10, 1937, and charged her with the murder of Jacob Wagner. Hamilton County prosecutors Dudley Outcalt, Loyal Martin, and Simon Lays were given the duty of presenting the state's case. For her defense, Anna was granted two attorneys, Joseph H. Hooden and Hiram Bossinger, Sr. Anna Hahn's trial began on October 11, 1937. Common Pleas Court Judge Charles S. Bell presided, and a jury, consisting of 11 women and 1 man, were selected to hear the case. From the start, the prosecutors insisted that Anna had killed Jacob Wagner out of greed, pointing out that his money and estate was the motive for the murder. A barrage of witnesses was then called forth, starting with hospital employees, who recounted Wagner's last agonizing days. According to the Cincinnati Enquirer, a chemist testified that the victim had enough arsenic in him to kill 4 men. A handwriting expert was then called forward and told the court that Wagner's will was a forgery and the handwriting was identical to Anna Hahn's. In an unusual move, Judge Bell allowed the state to introduce evidence relating to the other poisoning cases to show a homicidal behavior pattern. George Heiss, presumably the only surviving victim, was also called forward to discuss his encounters with Hahn and his subsequent illness. As the state's case wound down, they presented the court with several exhibits, which oddly enough included Jacob Wagner and Albert Palmer's internal organs. The prosecution rested its case on October 29, 1937. On Monday, November 1, 1937, the defense began its presentation. With little evidence of their own to refute the state's claims, the defense was left only with the defendant. Once on the stand, Anna denied any wrongdoing, and during cross-examination could not be slipped up. This, however, amounted to little in comparison to the state's mountain of evidence and witnesses. With little else to do, the defense decided to hold their cards for closing arguments and rested their case on November 4, 1937. The Cincinnati Crime Book states that prosecutor Dudley Outcault was chosen to make the state's closing arguments, and he wasted little time in getting to the point. She is sly because she developed her relationships with old men who had no relatives and lived alone. She is avaricious because no act was so low, but she was ready to commit it for a slight gain. She is cold-blooded, like no other woman in the world, because no one could sit here for 4 weeks and hear this damaging parade of evidence and display no emotion. She is heartless because nobody can deal out the death she dealt to these old men with a heart. We've seen here the coldest, most heartless, cruel person that ever has come within the scope of our lives. In the 4 corners of this courtroom stand 4 dead men: Zellman, Palmer, Wagner, Obendorfer. From the 4 corners, bony fingers point at her and say, "That woman poisoned me. That woman made my last moments an agony. That woman tortured me with the tortures of the damned." Then, turning to you, they say, "Let my death not be entirely in vain. My life cannot be brought back, but through my death and the punishment to be inflicted upon her, you can prevent such a death from coming to another man." From the 4 corners of this room, those old men say to you, "Do your duty." I ask of you, for the state of Ohio, that you withhold any recommendations of mercy. Following the prosecution's closing arguments, defense attorney Joseph H. Hooden stood up for the defense and addressed the jury. "I will not say that a single witness lied, but this case has had such widespread publicity that it would have been impossible for these witnesses not to have preconceived ideas before they ever came into this courtroom. Particularly, this is true of the witnesses from Wagner's neighborhood, where the case has been the chief topic of conversation for months. Although she is no angel, she is not guilty of the murder of Jacob Wagner." It only took 2 hours for the jury to return with their verdict. Anna Hahn sat motionless as the jury foreman read the decision. Guilty, with no recommendation for mercy. Following the verdict, each jury member was polled, and each one affirmed his or her vote. Anna was then handcuffed and led back to her jail cell. While the jury may not have immediately realized it at the time, their decision was historic. The lack of recommendation for mercy meant that Anna Hahn would automatically be sentenced to death. The state of Ohio had never executed a woman before. On November 10, 1937, Anna was again brought before Judge Bell. However, this time there was no question of her guilt, and the sole purpose of the hearing was to announce her ultimate fate. Judge Bell asked Anna if she had anything she wanted to say. "I have," she replied. "I'm innocent, Your Honor." Judge Bell paused momentarily and then formally sentenced her. "It is ordered adjudged and desired by the court that the defendant, Anna Marie Hahn, be taken hence to jail in Hamilton County, Ohio, and that within 30 days hereof the sheriff of Hamilton County shall convey the said defendant to the Ohio Penitentiary and deliver her to the warden thereof, and that on March 10, 1938, the said warden shall cause a current of electricity sufficient to cause death to pass through the body of the said defendant, the application of such current to be continued until the said defendant is dead. Looking directly into Anna's eyes, he concluded, "And may God, in his infinite wisdom, have mercy on your soul." Anna Marie Hahn was transferred to the Ohio State Penitentiary on December 1, 1937. Her attorneys kept the court system busy with appeals, and her March 10th execution date came and went. Her case passed through the Ohio court system several times before being taken to the United States Supreme Court. Nonetheless, they agreed with the state of Ohio and refused to block her execution. On Tuesday, December 6, 1938, Ohio Governor Martin L. Davey made a formal statement in which he refused to interfere with the decision of the courts. Later that day, accounts on local radio, by special dispatch from the Cincinnati Enquirer, reported that Anna's execution was scheduled for 8 o'clock the next evening. The following day, Anna spent much of her time writing 4 separate letters, which she later handed to her attorneys. As the clock grew nearer, her emotions became more difficult to control, and she was an emotional wreck by the time prison authorities arrived to walk her down to the death chamber. "Oh, Heavenly Father! Oh, God! Oh, God, I can't go! I won't go!" she cried out, according to the Cincinnati crime book. She would not walk to the chamber on her own and had to rely on the guards to help her along. As they made their way into the death chamber, Anna passed out and collapsed to the floor. Officials quickly revived her with an ammonia capsule and then strapped her into the chair. "Don't do this to me," she continued to cry out. "Oh, no, no, no! Warden Woodward, don't let them do this to me!" Tears began to roll down Warden Woodward's face as he solemnly replied, "I'm sorry, but we can't help it." Upon hearing the warden's words, Anna began to scream. "Please don't! Oh, my boy! Think of my boy! Won't anyone come and do something for me? Isn't there anybody to help me? Anyone? Anyone? Is nobody going to help me?" As prison officials let the clock click down, in the off chance that the governor might call, Anna called out for Father John Sullivan, the prison chaplain. "Father, come close," she said. Together, the two began to recite the Lord's Prayer, but just halfway through, the switch was thrown, and Anna's body jerked and convulsed as the electricity flowed through it. Anna Marie Hahn was officially pronounced dead at 8:13 p.m. The Ohio Historical Society reports that on December 8, 1938, Anna Marie Hahn's body was buried in an unsanctified ground at the Holy Cross Catholic Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio. Following Anna's execution, on December 17, 1938, defense attorney Joseph H. Hooden announced that the letters Anna had given him the night of her execution had been sold to the Cincinnati Enquirer, and the money was put into a trust for Anna's son, Oscar. The next day, the paper announced that they would be publishing the letters in the following 2 days. "I don't know how I could have done the things I did in my life. Only God knows what came over me when I gave Albert Palmer that first one, that poison that caused his death. When I stood by Mr. Wagner and he was laid out at the funeral home, I didn't know how it was I didn't scream out at the top of my voice. I couldn't in my mind believe that it was me. I can't believe it even today. I couldn't believe it when, in the court, those people came to the room and told the jury how they said these men died. I was sitting there hearing a story like out of a book, all about another person. As things come to my mind now, and as I put them on this paper, I can't believe I'm writing about things I did myself. However, they must be about me, because they are in my mind and I know them. God above will tell me what made me do these terrible things. I couldn't have been in my right mind when I did them. I loved all people so much. Now I am so close to death. Death is all around me. I have been here on death row for what seems like another lifetime already. Several other people in this place have been called out. Anna went on to tell of her life in Germany and her eventual immigration to the United States. She then began to recount the circumstances which she claimed eventually led to her life of crime. I went into business again, always thinking about my boy that would have money to raise him properly. However, business was bad again, and this time, before I lost everything, I sold it to pay all my debts. In a little while, though, this money went. My husband and I had been out of work, and I started worrying about my boy's future. I became crazy with fears that my boy and I would starve. I signed some notes for my husband. Because I had signed these notes, they threatened to take my Coleraine Avenue house away from me, to sell the house over my head, and throw my boy and me out into the street. Then it was that I started gambling and playing the racehorses. I wanted to make some money for my boy. During one of her outings to the horse track, Anna met Albert Palmer. The two grew close over time, and Anna eventually started to borrow betting money from Albert. I paid much of it back. Then, when I didn't pay it back fast enough to suit him, then it was that he wanted me to be his girl. He threatened me that if I didn't do what he asked, he would get his attorney to get the rest of the money that I borrowed from him. He wouldn't leave me alone. God knows that I did not want to kill him, and I don't know what put such a thought in my head. I remembered that down in the cellar was some rat poison. Something in my mind kept saying to me, "Give him a little bit of this, and he won't trouble you anymore." I didn't know what made me do it, but I slipped some of the poison in the oysters. I told him to go on home, and he left at the same time, threatening what he was going to do to me. A short time later, Anna learned from one of Albert's relatives that he had become suddenly ill and was in the hospital. I visited him just as soon as I could, and he was very nice to me. He told me that he was sorry for the way that he had treated me. I prayed that he would get well. Nobody knows the things that went through my mind. I told the nurses and doctors to do everything they could to make him well. But on Holy Thursday, Mr. Palmer died. Only I knew why. Anna described a struggle within her and the trouble she had accepting what she had done. Nonetheless, the battle was short-lived, and it was not long before she moved on. In describing her encounter with George Hess, Anna denied any wrongdoing, but did admit foul play regarding Jacob Wagner's ultimate fate. Anna had stolen some of Wagner's bank books, and when he found out, she became scared that he would turn her in. I got scared that if the police would start questioning me, maybe all this about Mr. Palmer would come out. Something cried out in me to stop him so that all my troubles wouldn't start again. I don't know what guided my hand, but I fixed him some orange juice and placed a half a teaspoon of the powder poison, which I took from my purse, in the glass. Mr. Wagner drank it down. Early the next day, I went back to the room, and Mr. Wagner was very sick. I knew what I had done to him. It was another mind that made me do these things. I didn't do them. I cannot describe how I felt when Mr. Wagner died, and that I had something to do with his death. I did not harm Mr. Wagner for his money. I never had such a thought. It was not until Mr. Wagner had died that I wrote the will. I placed it in his room on the afternoon that the man from the probate came to Mr. Wagner's room. The poison that I used is, for all that I know, still in my house. I found it first in the paint cupboard in the basement. If I'd never found that poison initially, I know that I would not be in all this trouble right now. Anna had little to say in regards to George Zellman and George Obendorfer. While she did not describe the circumstances surrounding the two men's premature deaths, she did appear to take credit for them. I cannot say anything about those other cases that came after, Mr. Yeltsin and that last one, Mr. Obendorfer, except that they died of the same symptoms, and as I face my Maker, I take full responsibility for what happened to them. As Anna's letter came to a close, she again described the battle she had to fight within her to keep her sanity, and touched upon her son and the concern she had for his well-being. There were times in the courtroom when the newspapers wrote that I seemed worried, that I was just about ready to cry out. I was just about ready to cry out. I could hardly keep my secret in me. It seemed that I would have to cry out. I wanted to cry out that they were trying the other Anna Hahn, and not this one sitting in the courtroom. Somehow, I kept the secret. I hope that God will take care of my son, for I do not want anything to happen to my boy. I feel that God has shown me my wrongs in life, and my only regret is that I have not the power to undo the trouble and heartache that I have caused. Signed, Anna Marie Hahn. After reading Anna's confession, detectives, while shocked that she admitted her crimes, were elated that, in the end, they got most of the answers they had desperately been seeking. Anna's son, 12-year-old Oscar Hahn, was placed in a foster family in the Midwest. The Cincinnati Crime Book claims that the newspaper kept its promise to Anna and bankrolled the boy's education and never revealed his name or whereabouts to the public. The only thing ever released about Oscar was that he lived a normal life and eventually fought for the Navy during World War II. The new nurse seemed very attentive with the children on the sick ward, although it seemed odd that she never picked up crying babies and showed no feelings when they died. Within 2 days of coming on the job, the Children's Ward 4 at Ingham's Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire, Beverley Allitt, 23, took to it enthusiastically. No one knew her history or how they might have thought twice before allowing her to get close to vulnerable charges. According to Terry Manners in Deadlier Than the Male, the area in central Britain where Allitt served as a nurse had a population of nearly 100,000 people, 1/3 of whom were children. More than 2,000 were born each year, and the highest percentage of them were born at the hospital where Allitt worked. Although she had a history of excessive sick leave and had repeatedly failed her nursing exams, she had been granted a temporary 6-month position at the understaffed hospital. While relieved, she was also bitter that she had been turned down at another hospital 30 miles away in Nottingham. She was determined to show the hospital administration just how competent she was and also get the attention she craved. On February 21, 1991, the mother of 7-week-old Liam Taylor brought him into the hospital with congested lungs. He had pneumonia, says Manners, but the Kellerers say in Murder Most Rare that it was a simple chest cold. Liam's father arrived, and Allitt made herself available to both parents. She reassured them that the boy was in good hands and sent them home to get some rest. When they returned, Allitt told them that Liam had gotten worse. He'd been rushed into emergency care and had recovered. As he got better, Allitt once again reassured the parents that she would watch over him. She had even volunteered for extra duty on his second night at the hospital. Liam's parents elected to stay as well and went to bed in a room for this purpose. Just before midnight, Liam went into another respiratory crisis, but everyone involved felt that he'd gotten through it and would rest. They all left Allitt alone with the boy, and then things got really bad. She sent 2 nurses to fetch some things she needed, and when one of them returned, she saw Allitt standing next to Liam, who appeared to be pale as a ghost. Then red blotches appeared on his face, and Allitt yelled for the crash team. The other nurses were confused. If Liam had stopped breathing, alarms should have sounded, but they hadn't. Soon the boy suffered cardiac arrest, and the doctors worked hard to get him breathing again. However, their efforts were in vain. Liam Taylor was alive only because of the life support machines that kept his lungs breathing. He'd suffered severe brain damage, and there was no reason to try to resuscitate him. His parents made the difficult decision of removing their baby from life support to allow him to die. This young boy with no history of heart disease had mysteriously succumbed to heart failure. Beverley Allitt watched the entire incident without a word and then put on her coat and went home. No one ever asked her about her part. She went back to work that afternoon as if nothing had happened. She had committed murder, and she believed that no one would ever know. Within the next 2 months, she attacked 9 children and murdered 4. Yet, to the suffering families, she was an angel of mercy, someone who was always available for their needs. How could a person be so caring and so demented at the same time? Yet, things were to get much worse. Nursing depends on trust because nurses are often alone with their patients. If they abuse that trust, the entire medical system suffers. On March 5th, 2 weeks after Liam Taylor died, the Children's Ward 4 received another patient. This 11-year-old boy, Timothy Hardwick, had cerebral palsy. He had suffered an epileptic fit and was brought to the hospital. Allitt quickly took over his care. She was quite solicitous in attending to the boy, but a few minutes after she was left alone with him, she came racing for help, yelling that he was going into cardiac arrest. The staff rushed to Timothy and found that his heart had stopped and he was turning blue. A specialist in pediatric medicine tried to save him, but finally pronounced him dead. It was completely unexpected. Even an autopsy failed to provide an obvious cause of death, although his epilepsy was officially blamed. 5 days later, Kaylee Desmond, just over a year old, had been hospitalized on March 3rd with a congested chest. Allitt attended to her, too, and she appeared to be recovering to everyone's satisfaction. Then, in the same bed where Liam had died, Kaylee went into cardiac arrest. The crash team revived her, and she was transferred to a hospital in Nottingham. Physicians there gave her a thorough examination, and they found an odd puncture hole under her armpit. Near it was an air bubble, which they attributed to an accidental injection. There was no investigation. Stymied by this missed opportunity, Allitt struck again and again, 3 times over the next 4 days. On March 20th, Paul Crampton, only 5 months old, was diagnosed with bronchitis. It wasn't a serious case, but he was placed into the children's area. Just before he was to be discharged, something appeared to go wrong. Allitt was attending him by herself when she called out that he had taken a turn for the worse. He seemed to be suffering from insulin shock, and on 3 separate occasions, he went into a near coma. Each time, the doctors pulled him out of it, but they were mystified as to why his blood sugar kept dropping. When he was taken by ambulance to a hospital in nearby Nottingham, Allitt rode with him, and he was again found to have too much insulin. He didn't die, but he came very close. The next day, 5-year-old Bradley Gibson had pneumonia, but quite suddenly, he suffered a heart attack. The team saved him after half an hour of strenuous effort, and, to its amazement, blood tests showed that his insulin was high. It made no sense. When he had another heart attack later that night, after being attended by Allitt, he was transported to Nottingham, where he recovered. At this point, things should have seemed suspicious, but no one around Allitt was looking over her shoulder. She continued with her quiet aggression, but rested for a day before trying again. This time, Yik Hung Chan, age 2, turned blue and appeared to be suffering some attack when Allitt raised the alarm, but he responded well to oxygen. Then, a few hours later, it happened again, so he was taken to the larger hospital in Nottingham. He had come very close to dying, but his symptoms were attributed to the fact that he'd fallen from a window and fractured his skull. At that point, Allitt turned her attention to twins, but, in a bizarre twist, the mother actually befriended her. The 2 baby girls were just 2 months old. Katie and Becky Phillips had been born prematurely and had remained in the hospital for a while before being sent home. There, they seemed to thrive, but then suffered from gastroenteritis. Becky came into Ward 4 on April 1st, 1991, and Allitt took over her care. 2 days later, the nurse went running for help when Becky appeared to be hypoglycemic. She was cold to the touch, Allitt claimed, but the nurse who responded could find nothing wrong. Little Becky went home with her mother. During the night, she went into convulsions and cried out in apparent pain. Her parents tried to do what they could and even summoned a doctor, but he thought she simply had colic. To keep watch over her, the parents kept her in their bed that night, where she quietly died. Taken again to the hospital, Becky's small body was tested, yet the pathologists could find no clear cause of death. To take an extra precaution with Katie, the remaining twin, the doctor had her admitted to Grantham, and, as fate would have it, the nurse on duty was Beverley Allitt. It wasn't long before she was running with the baby in her arms, shouting out, "Cardiac arrest!" Indeed, Katie had stopped breathing and was quickly succumbing to the lack of oxygen. She was saved, but the same thing happened 2 days later. This time, her lungs collapsed, and it proved difficult to encourage her to breathe again. Once they did, they transferred her to Nottingham, where it was found that 5 of her ribs were broken. They felt sure she had suffered serious brain damage from her oxygen deprivation. Ironically, Katie's mother, Sue Phillips, felt so grateful to Allitt for saving her baby's life that she asked her to be Katie's godmother. Allitt accepted the honor. She acted as if she'd been a hero, when in fact, thanks to Allitt, this child now had cerebral palsy, paralysis, and damage to both her sight and hearing. Little did the Phillipses know. Allitt continued attacking the children at the hospital. 4 more who had been more or less healthy succumbed to the same kinds of disorders. Allitt was always involved in the child's care, yet no one at Grantham was asking why so many children in such a short span of time under the care of the same nurse should be suffering from the same life-threatening conditions. However, people at Nottingham's hospital were beginning to suspect that something was amiss. It was the death of a 15-month-old girl that finally brought the spree to an end. Claire Peck was asthmatic, and she was taken to a treatment room to have a tube put down her throat to help her breathe. Allitt was left alone with her for a few minutes, and in that space of time, the child had a heart attack. "Arrest!" Allitt called out. The team ran back in and revived her. Then they left her alone with Allitt once more, and once more she shouted, "Arrest!" Again, the doctors worked to stabilize Claire, but this time they failed. When she died, one of them said, "This should never have happened." He was right. When an autopsy indicated that Claire had died from natural causes, an inquiry was held regarding the high number of cardiac arrests over the past 2 months on Ward 4. They checked for an airborne virus, but nothing was found. A test that indicated a high level of potassium in the last victim's body made the inquiry more urgent. Yet, according to the Kelleher's, it still took 18 more days for the police to be called in. They exhumed Claire for further tests and found traces of the drug lignocaine in her tissues, a substance used in circumstances of cardiac arrest, but never in a baby. Superintendent Stuart Clifton believed they had a killer on their hands. He examined some of the other perplexing cases and found inordinately high doses of insulin. He also learned that Nurse Allitt had reported the key missing to the refrigerator that contained the insulin. He checked all records, talked with the parents of the victims, and installed a security camera into Ward 4. He even learned about Munchausen by proxy syndrome, in which people harm others in order to get attention in some fashion, typically from a medical community. Detectives going over the daily nursing log found pages missing that correspond to the time period when Paul Crampton had been in the ward. That was suspicious. They then counted up 25 separate suspicious episodes with 13 victims, 4 of which were dead, and looked for something they all had in common. The pattern was clear. Beverley Allitt was the only person who had been part of every episode. Within 3 weeks, they arrested her. Allitt denied that she had any part in the attacks, apart from caring for the victims. She showed no nervousness under interrogation, but a search of her home revealed parts of the missing log. While the initial evidence seemed damning, the parents of little Katie, who had invited Allitt to be a godmother, hired a detective to help clear her. They were soon to regret the trust they had placed in her. In the meantime, the police were looking into her background. They came up with a pattern that pointed to a very serious personality disorder. Beverley Allitt was thought to have suffered from both Munchausen syndrome and Munchausen by proxy syndrome. These conditions belong to the group known as factitious disorders, which are characterized by physical or psychological symptoms that are feigned, exaggerated, or self-induced. It's not common to find both in the same person, but the core motivation, getting attention through illness, is common to both. Let's first discuss Munchausen syndrome, a disorder in which people fake an illness to obtain medical care. One of the worst cases on record is that of Wendy Scott, a British woman who was admitted to more than 600 hospitals in 12 years and underwent a shocking 42 unnecessary surgeries. Scott's illness, she believed, had developed from the attention of a kind nurse during childhood, an experience she'd never had before. When she started to work in a depressing job as an adult, it wasn't long before she realized that illness brought her the affection she sought from others. Thus began her odyssey as a hospital hobo. Eventually, she recovered and started a support group, but she had done more damage than she realized. When she eventually experienced genuine problems, it was difficult to get help. London physicians knew her record of faking complaints and turned her away, so she tried elsewhere, but the multiple scars on her abdomen alerted caregivers to her disorder. Finally, she got help in the US, but it turned out that she had inoperable intestinal cancer. 6 months later, she died. Dr. Mark Feldman, a psychiatrist at the University of Alabama and co-author of Patient or Pretender: Inside the Strange World of Factitious Disorders, says that people who suffer from Munchausen syndrome generally present dramatic symptoms, including serious self-mutilation or injecting themselves with a toxin. Often they return to a healthcare facility over and over. They mostly just seek attention and care, although a small percentage of them have a different motive. They want to baffle a physician so they can feel powerful. If the medical staff at one place suspects fakery, the patient moves on to another. Most Munchausen patients are male, and they range in age from children to the elderly, although the illness often peaks in middle age. Females may stick to a set of symptoms and bond with one doctor, but both genders know how to lie in great detail and to disguise what they're doing. They usually know about as much about their disorders as their doctors. Of the percentage of patients faking a disorder, only 10% have Munchausen syndrome, although it's difficult to be accurate. We can only count a case for statistical purposes, says Feldman, when the deceptions have failed. If someone is very crafty, he or she will never be caught, and so there will never be the opportunity to add the case to the list. British physician Richard Asher published the first account of Munchausen syndrome in 1951. He described 3 people who went from doctor to doctor with fake illnesses. Since these imposters often tell whopping lies, Asher named the condition after Hieronymus Karl Friedrich von Munchausen, an 18th century German baron who wowed his friends with endless tales of exotic adventures, all of which he fabricated. Almost every disease has been mimicked by Munchausen patients, making diagnosis tricky. Even so, Munchausen syndrome is not hypochondria. These people know they are not ill, and they tend not to improve. They don't wish to. It also differs from malingering, which involves faking for clear external gain. A criminal who mimics mental illness to avoid a trial is malingering. For Munchausen sufferers, the point is the treatment, and they will do whatever it takes to get it. In his book Lies, Lies, Lies: The Psychology of Deceit, Charles Ford describes a patient with the ability to mimic renal colic who more than once caused the emergency landing of a commercial airplane. It appears that the childhood experience of many of these people includes a sadistic, neglectful, or rejecting parent. They may also have some experience with a caregiver during a long illness that made them feel special, or they found that faking an illness got attention while well-being did not. The motives are simple to understand, but the condition is nearly impossible to treat. The most common signals to doctors include a textbook case of symptom patterns, a long and varied history of medical workups, numerous surgical scars, inconsistent lab tests, and evidence of lying in other areas, such as a name, address, or previous physician. For Munchausen patients, the prognosis is poor because they tend to ignore psychiatric referrals. Instead, they move on to the next healthcare facility. As dangerous as these people can be towards themselves, it's when the syndrome makes a substitution of others for self that it becomes truly depraved. That's what Beverley Allitt eventually did. As a child, Allitt wore bandages and casts over wounds that she would use for attention, but not allowed to be examined. One of 4 children, she seemed happy for a while, but became overweight as an adolescent. From that time on, as the Kellerers write, she suffered from a volatile temperament, becoming aggressive toward others, and complaining of a series of physical ailments that sent her into a hospital. She had gallbladder pain, headaches, urinary infections, uncontrolled vomiting, blurred vision, minor injuries, appendicitis, back trouble, and ulcers, to name a few. In Deadlier Than the Male, Manners brings out the fact that Allitt actually persuaded a doctor to remove a perfectly healthy appendix and then failed to heal because she kept plucking at the surgical scar. She also injured herself with a hammer and glass. Doctors soon had her number, aware that she was wasting their resources, and she ended up going from one to another. She became a nurse, and even as she trained to be a caretaker, she did odd things that got her noticed. Manners says that when she worked in a nursing home, she was suspected of smearing feces on the walls and putting it in the refrigerator for others to find. She also missed an inordinate number of workdays for reasons of illness. Her boyfriend of 2 years said later that she was aggressive, manipulative, and deceptive, and she would pretend that she was pregnant when she was not. Then she got involved with another nurse and ended her relationship with him. When she found that her illnesses were not inspiring the positive attention they once had, she found another venue by abusing children, and her behavior exhibited is what is known as Munchausen by proxy syndrome, MHBP. First identified in 1977, the common pattern is that of an apparently devoted parent bringing her child over and over to the doctor to treat some mysterious illness that he or she cannot seem to cure. It's the mother who makes the child ill, says Betty Alt and Sandra Wells in Wicked Women, but she denies any knowledge about the source of the illness. She may feed the child poison to induce abdominal pain, aggravate or infect existing sores, induce apnea by smothering, or twist to break bones. One mother even injected her child with fecal matter. In other words, they injure another in order to bring attention to themselves. The MHBP mother comes across as a martyr, taking her child dutifully from one specialist to another, but there is evidence that she also tries to thwart the caregivers. Laura Berman wrote about Mary Burke, the child of an MHBP mother who was a nurse and a physician's daughter. Mary got her start as an invalid by falling down a flight of stairs, but in point of fact, her mother would hit her legs with a hammer to keep her from healing. She would also open her wounds with a nail, yet all the while to others, she appeared the caring mother. She warned Mary that if she ever told, she'd be locked up, which effectively scared the child into silence. When Mary finally stood up to her mother, the abuse on her stopped, but started up with her younger brother. Deborah Sherman Coughlin says that people with this disorder receive a sense of importance and self-worth from harming a child, then saving the infant by rushing the child to medical care. If the child remains ill, the person is calm, but if the child recovers, the person gets agitated. Psychiatrist Philip Resnick says that 85% of the time in Munchausen by proxy, the mother is the likely perpetrator, and the mortality rate for these children is significant. One mother was even filmed on a hidden video camera in her child's hospital room, intentionally smothering him when he seemed to get better. A psychiatrist visited Allitt in prison, and he believed she had these disorders, as did a pediatric specialist who spoke with her twice. Neither could get her to confess what she had done. After a series of hearings, Allitt was charged with 4 counts of murder, 11 counts of attempted murder, and 11 counts of causing grievous bodily harm. As she awaited the trial, she rapidly lost weight and succumbed to anorexia nervosa, one more indication of her psychological problems. After numerous delays due to her illnesses, she went to trial at Nottingham Crown Court, where prosecutors showed the jury how she had been present at each suspicious episode, how she had craved attention most of her life, and how she had shown a cold manner when the babies suffered. They also pointed out that the mysterious attacks had stopped when she was taken off the ward and indicated the high readings of insulin and evidence of drug injection in each of the victims. She was accused of cutting off their oxygen, either by smothering or by tampering with machines. The pediatrics expert, Professor Roy Meadow, explained Munchausen syndrome and Munchausen by proxy syndrome, pointing out how Allitt demonstrated symptoms of both. He also talked about her odd post-arrest behavior. When she was hospitalized in 1991, she tampered with a thermometer to produce readings that puzzled the nurses and doctors, and she apparently punctured her right breast to inject herself with water. Having seen a number of cases of the syndromes himself, Meadow indicated that such people can harm others with no awareness of how much suffering they're causing. They close themselves off to it. In his opinion, Beverley Allitt could not be cured. That meant that she was a clear danger to others. After a trial that lasted nearly 2 months, and in which the defendant attended only 16 days due to illness, on May 23, 1993, Allitt was convicted and given 13 life sentences for murder and attempted murder. It was the harshest sentence ever given to a woman, but according to the judge, it was in part for the victims, in part for the families, and in part for how she had brought doubt upon the integrity of a noble profession. Going to prison didn't stop her, however. She began to injure herself again to get attention by stabbing herself with paper clips and pouring boiling water on her hand. Eventually, she admitted to 3 of the murders and 6 assaults. She is one of Britain's most prolific female serial offenders. Some of what you've heard about Aileen Wuornos is true. Yes, she killed 7 men in Florida. Yes, she was a prostitute. She gave a shocking, detailed confession at the behest of her lesbian ex-lover, and during her trial, she was legally adopted by a well-meaning woman who claimed to receive her instruction from God. She had memorable profane outbursts in more than one courtroom, and she was executed October 9, 2002, the recipient of 6 death sentences, more than anyone else residing on death row. All these things are true. However, it is essential to dispel some of the hyperbole surrounding the Wuornos case at the outset. She was not America's first female serial killer. Women have been murdering serially for as long as men, although their victims are usually family members or acquaintances, and they most often choose poison over other means of disposal. Wuornos killed strangers with a gun, an unusual but not unprecedented fact that the media seized upon and ran with rampantly. Furthermore, Wuornos' activities as a prostitute are ridiculously exaggerated. Her claim of having sex with 250,000 men, which was widely reported as truth, is preposterous. Such a feat would require the bedding of 35 different men a day, every day, for 20 years. Wuornos had neither the stamina nor the planning skills necessary for such a record-breaking performance. Even with these most sensational claims discredited, Aileen Wuornos remains intriguing. She is both repellent and strangely pathetic. Her belligerence all but sealed her fate from the moment she was apprehended and inspired contempt in most who encountered her or heard of her case. Her bravado and her claims that all 7 of her victims tried to rape her are as incomprehensible as her boast of having serviced 250,000 Johns. Add to these the melodrama of her confession, her befriending and adoption by Arlene Prahl, and her never-had-a-chance personal history, and her story fairly reels one in. To characterize Aileen Wuornos' start in life as a poor beginning is truly an understatement. It was an awful beginning from the time she was born, February 29, 1956, as Aileen Carol Pittman. One of the few good things in her young life, ironically, was that her biological father, Leo Dale Pittman, never got to know her. Pittman was a psychopathic child molester who hanged himself in prison in 1969. When his grandfather died of throat cancer, his grandmother spoiled him even more, baking him cakes and giving him money. In his teens, he returned her love and kindness by beating and abusing her. One of his favorite games was to tie 2 cats together by their tails and throw them over a clothesline to watch them fight. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, married Pittman when she was 15 and bore him 2 children in Rochester, Michigan. Aileen's older brother, Keith, was born in 1955. Diane divorced Pittman less than 2 years into the marriage, a few months before Aileen was born. Diane was afraid of Pittman, and with good reason. Diane found the responsibilities of single motherhood unbearable, and in 1960, she abandoned Aileen and her brother Keith, who were then adopted by their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, in 1960. They did not reveal that they were, in fact, the children's grandparents. Aileen discovered the truth at around age 12, information which did not help an already troublesome situation. Lori Wuornos drank heavily and was strict with the children. When Aileen and Keith discovered their true parentage, they rebelled. In 1962, at age 6, she was severely burned while she and Keith set fires with lighter fluid. Although she recovered, she was permanently scarred on her face. When the doubled-over belt flew down onto her bare buttocks, little Aileen railed against her father, petrified and crying noisily. Sometimes she lay face down, spread-eagled and naked on the bed, for her whippings. Aileen was sexually promiscuous at a very young age and later told the police that she had sex with Keith at an early age, although acquaintances doubt the story. Aileen was pregnant at age 14 and sent to an unwed mother's home. She had a boy who was adopted in 1971. Fortunately for the child, Aileen did not end up raising him. In July of the same year, Britta Wuornos died, supposedly of liver failure. Diane, Eileen's biological mother, believed that Lori killed her. Aileen and Keith's truancy and pregnancy put Britta through a lot of stress, and she had started to drink heavily again. The night of Britta's death, she was having convulsions. If there was culpability on the part of Lori, it was the fact that he did not call the ambulance in time because he had no money. Aileen, known to friends as Lee, dropped out of school, left home, and took up hitchhiking and prostitution. In the next few years, Keith died of throat cancer at the age of 21. Lori committed suicide, and Aileen headed for Florida. When Aileen was 20, she was hitchhiking when a wealthy 69-year-old yacht club president named Louis Fell picked her up. He fell in love with her instantly. When they married in 1976, the news was actually printed in the society pages. This was a real stroke of luck for her, but she was too wild and destructive to understand when she had it good. She treated Fell badly, got into bar fights, and was sent to jail for assault. Needless to say, in a month or so after the marriage, Fell realized his mistake and had the marriage annulled. For the next decade, she lurched from one failed relationship to another, engaging in prostitution, forgery, theft, and armed robbery. Along the way, she tried to commit suicide. Emotionally and physically, she was a mess from the drinking and doping and self-destructive lifestyle. When she met 24-year-old Tyria Moore at a Daytona gay bar in 1986, Aileen was lonely and angry and ready for something new. For a while, it was great. Ty loved her and didn't leave her. She even quit her job as a motel maid for a while and allowed Lee to support her with her prostitution earnings. Their ardor cooled, however, and money ran short. Still, Ty stayed with Lee, following her from cheap motel to cheap motel, with stints in old barns or in the woods in between. Lee's market value as a prostitute, never spectacular, fell even more. Their existence, meager though it was, became ever harder to maintain. Clearly, something had to change. Richard Mallory liked to change now and again, too. The middle-aged owner of a Clearwater, Florida electronics repair business was known to close up shop abruptly and disappear for a few days at a time on drinking and sex binges. He changed the locks to his apartment 8 times in 3 years. He kept employees at his business only long enough to clear the backlog of work that accrued during one of his disappearances, letting them go once his repair orders were caught up again. His only constants were alcohol, sex, and paranoia. So when he didn't show up to open his shop in early December 1989, no one thought much of it. There was no one close enough to him to notice he was gone. It wasn't until his 1977 Cadillac was found a few days later outside Daytona that anyone knew anything was amiss. On December 13, 1989, 2 young men were looking for scrap metal along a dirt road close to Interstate 95 in Volusia County, Florida. Instead of saleable junk, they found a body wrapped in a rubber-backed carpet runner. Fingerprints carefully taken from the badly decomposed hands proved that this was Richard Mallory, who had last been seen 13 days earlier. He had been killed with 3 shots from a .22. Several months of investigation into his sordid lifestyle and somewhat shady acquaintances produced no real leads. Initial suspicion revolved around a stripper who went by the name of Chastity. Sue Russell writes that Chastity had told her boyfriend that she had gone for several days to party with Mallory and that she had killed him. When investigators arrested Chastity, they realized that her confession was prompted by a burst of anger at her boyfriend and was not true. After a number of dead ends, Mallory's case went cold. On June 1st, another unidentified naked male body was found in the woods of Citrus County, Florida, about 40 miles north of Tampa. The victim was identified on June 7th as David Spears, 43, of Sarasota. Spears had been a heavy equipment operator who was last seen on May 19th. He told his boss that he was going to Orlando, but he never made it. His truck was found shortly after that on Interstate 75 with the doors unlocked and the license plate missing. Spears had been shot several times with a .22. Manners writes that a used condom was found near his body. Meanwhile, 30 miles south in Pasco County, yet another naked body was found a few miles off Interstate 75. This one was discovered on June 6th and was so badly decomposed that medical examiners were not able to obtain fingerprints and could not estimate the time of death. The 9 bullets found in the remains were damaged by the decomposition, but were determined to have come from a .22 caliber weapon. According to Michael Reynolds, Pasco County Detective Tom Muck had no immediate luck identifying his John Doe, later determined to be Charles Carskadon, but had heard about the case in Citrus County. He notified Citrus County Sheriff's investigator Marvin Paget about the similarities and told him to stay in touch. On July 4th, a car careened off State Road 315 near Orange Springs, Florida, and came to rest in some brush. Rhonda Bailey, who was sitting on her porch at the time and watched the accident happen, said 2 women clambered frantically from the car, throwing beer cans into the woods and swearing at each other. The brown-haired woman said little. The blonde, whose arm was bleeding from an injury sustained in the crash, did most of the talking. She begged Bailey not to call the police, saying her father lived just up the road. She and her companion got back in the car, which now had a smashed windshield and other damage, and got it out of the brush. The crippled vehicle didn't take them far, though. They abandoned it just down the road and began walking. Hubert Hewitt of the Orange Springs Volunteer Fire Department responded to a call about the accident and asked the 2 women if they had been the ones in the car. The blonde cursed at him and said no, they had not, and they did not want any help. He left them alone, and they walked on. Marion County Sheriff's deputies found the car where the women had left it. It was a 1988 Pontiac Sunbird, gray with 4 doors. The glass in the front doors, as well as the windshield, were smashed. There were apparent bloodstains throughout the interior, and the license plate was missing. A computer search based on the VIN number revealed that the car belonged to Peter Seams, who had disappeared on June 7th after leaving his home in Jupiter, Florida, to visit relatives in Arkansas. Seams was a 65-year-old retired merchant seaman who devoted much of his time to a Christian outreach ministry. John Wisniewski of the Jupiter Police, who had been working the case since Seams was reported missing, sent out a nationwide teletype containing descriptions of the 2 women. He also sent a synopsis of the case and sketches of the women to the Florida Criminal Activity Bulletin. Then he waited. He was not optimistic about finding Seams alive. Troy Burris left on his delivery route from Gilchrist Sausage early on the morning of July 30th. When he didn't return that afternoon, Gilchrist manager Johnny May Thompson started calling around and discovered Burris hadn't shown up at his last few delivery stops. Late that night, she and her husband went out looking for him. At 2 a.m., Burris's wife reported him missing. At 4 a.m., Marion County Sheriff's deputies found his truck on the shoulder of State Road 19, 20 miles east of Ocala. It was unlocked and the keys were missing. So was Burris. He was found 5 days later. A family out for a picnic in the Ocala National Forest happened upon his body in a clearing just off Highway 19, about 8 miles from where his truck was found. The Florida heat and humidity had hastened decomposition, precluding identification at the scene, but his wife identified his wedding ring. He had been killed with 2 shots from a .22 caliber gun, one to the chest and one to the back. Investigator John Tilley's initial suspect was a drifter named Curtis Michael Blankenship. He had been hitchhiking on Highway 19 the day of Burris's disappearance and was picked up close to the abandoned truck. It became evident as the investigation progressed, however, that Blankenship was not involved. For the time being, Tilley had no more suspects. Dick Humphreys never made it home from his last day of work at the Sumterville office of the Florida's Department of Health and Rehabilitation Services. A protective investigator specializing in abused and injured children, he was about to transfer to the department's Ocala office. He was 56, and this was not his first career. Previously, He'd been a police chief in Alabama. He celebrated his 35th wedding anniversary on September 10th. On September 11th, he disappeared. On the evening of September 12th, his body was found in Marion County. He'd been shot 7 times. 6 .22 caliber slugs were recovered from his body. The 7th went through his wrist and was never found. His car was found in late September in Suwannee County. About a month later, the nude body of Walter Gino Antonio was found on a logging road in Dixie County. 60-year-old Antonio was a trucker, a sometime security guard, and a member of the Reserve Police. He'd been shot 4 times with a .22. When he was found on November 19th, he'd been dead less than 24 hours. His car was found 5 days later across the state in Brevard County. Captain Steve Binniger was command of the Marion County Sheriff's Criminal Investigation Division, and he knew about the crimes in Citrus and Pasco counties. He could not ignore the similarities and was formulating a theory, along with the multi-agency task force with representatives from counties where victims were found. No one stopped to pick up hitchhikers anymore, he reasoned, so the perpetrator, or perpetrators, of these crimes had to be initially non-threatening to the victims. He suspected women. Specifically, he suspected the 2 women who had wrecked Peter Seam's car and walked away. He turned to the press for help. In late November, Reuters ran a story about the killings, saying police were looking for the women. Papers across Florida picked up the story and ran with it, along with the police sketches of the women in question. It didn't take long for the leads to start pouring in, and by mid-December, police had several tips involving the same 2 women. A man in Homosassa Springs said the 2 women had rented a trailer from him about a year earlier. Their names were Tyria Moore and Lee. A woman in Tampa said the women had worked at her motel south of Ocala. Their names, she said, were Tyria Moore and Susan Blahovec. An anonymous caller identified the women as Ty Moore and Lee Blahovec, who bought an RV in Homosassa Springs. Lee Blahovec was the dominant one, the caller said, and a truck stop prostitute. Both were lesbians. The mother lode, though, came from Port Orange near Daytona. Police there had been tracking the movements of Lee Blahovec and Tyria Moore and provided a detailed account of the couple's movements from late September to mid-December. They had stayed, primarily, at the Fairview Motels in Harbor Oaks, where Blahovec registered as Cami Marsh Green. They spent a bit of time living in the small apartment behind a restaurant very near the Fairview, but returned to the motel. In early December, they left the Fairview. Blahovec Green returned alone and stayed until December 10. A quick computer check gave the driver's license and criminal record information on Tyria Moore, Susan Blahovec, and Cami Marsh Green. Moore had no real record, breaking and entering charges against her in 1983 having been dropped. Blahovec had 1 trespassing arrest, while Green had no record at all. Additionally, the photograph on Blahovec's license did not match the one for Green. The Green ID was the one that paid off best. Volusia County officers checked area pawn shops and found that in Daytona, Cami Marsh Green had pawned a camera and a radar detector and had left the requisite thumbprint on the receipt. These items had belonged to Richard Mallory. In Ormond Beach, she pawned a set of tools that matched the description of those taken from David Spears's truck. The thumbprint was the key. Jenny Ahern of the Automated Fingerprint Identification System found nothing on her initial computer search, but came to Volusia County and began a hand search of fingerprint records there. Within an hour, she found what she came for. The print showed up on a weapons charge and outstanding warrant against a Laurie Grody. A bloody palm print found in Peter Sims's Sunbird matched Laurie Grody's prints as well. All this information was sent to the National Crime Information Center. Responses came from Michigan, Colorado, and Florida. Laurie Grody, Susan Blahovec, and Cami Marsh Green were all aliases for Aileen Carol Wuornos. The hunt for Wuornos began in earnest on January 5, 1991. Pairs of officers, including 2 undercover as Bucket and Drums, drug dealers down from Georgia, hit the streets, hoping to track her down. On the evening of January the 8th, Mike Joyner and Dick Martin, in their roles as Bucket and Drums, spotted her at the Port Orange pub. They meant for their takedown to develop gradually, as they wanted an airtight case, but Port Orange police entered suddenly and took Wuornos outside. Mike Joyner frantically phoned the command post at the Pirates Cove Motel, where authorities from 6 jurisdictions had come to work the case. This development wasn't because of a leak, they surmised. These were just cops doing their jobs. Bob Kelly of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office called the Port Orange police station and told them not to arrest Wuornos under any circumstances. The word was relayed to the cops in the nick of time, and Wuornos returned to the bar. Joyner and Martin struck up a conversation with her and bought her a few beers. She left the bar at around 10 o'clock, declining an offer for a ride. Once again, the cautious takedown was almost ruined. 2 Florida Department of Law Enforcement officers pulled up behind Wuornos as she walked down Ridgewood Avenue, following her with their lights off. Officers at the command post made a call to get the FDLE officers off the street, and Wuornos made it to her next destination, a biker bar called The Last Resort. Joyner and Martin met her there for a while, drank more beers, shot more bull. They left just after midnight. Wuornos didn't leave at all. She spent her last night of freedom sleeping on an old car seat in The Last Resort. The following afternoon, Joyner and Martin were back at The Last Resort as Bucket and Drums, talking Wuornos up and wearing transmitters that kept the police apprised of everything that went on. They had planned on making their caller later that night, but The Last Resort was gearing up for a barbecue and bikers would start pouring in any second. The decision was made at the command post to go ahead with the arrest. Joyner and Martin asked Wuornos if she'd like to get cleaned up at their motel room. She accepted their offer and left the bar with them. Outside on the steps, Larry Horzipa of the Volusia County Sheriff's Office approached her and told her she was being arrested on the outstanding warrant for Lori Grody. No mention was made of the murders, and no announcement was made to the media that a suspect had been arrested. Their caution was wise. As of yet, they had no murder weapon and no Tyria Moore. On January 10th, Moore was located. She was living with her sister in Pittston, Pennsylvania. Jerry Thompson of Citrus County and Bruce Munster of Marion County flew to Scranton, Pennsylvania to interview her. She was read her rights, but not charged with anything. Munster made sure she knew what perjury was, swore her in, and sat back as she gave her statement. She had known about the murders since Lee had come home with Richard Mallory's Cadillac, she said. Lee had openly confessed that she had killed a man that day, but Moore told her not to say anything else. I told her I didn't want to hear about it, Moore told Munster and Thompson. And then any time she would come home after that and say certain things, telling me about where she got something, I'd say I don't want to hear it. She had her suspicions, she admitted, but wanted to know as little as possible about Lee's doings. The more she knew, she reasoned, the more compelled she would feel about reporting Lee to the authorities. And she didn't want to do that. I was just scared, she said. She always said she'd never hurt me, but then you can't believe her, so I didn't know what she would have done. The next day, Moore accompanied Munster and Thompson back to Florida to assist the investigation. A confession would make the case against Wuornos virtually airtight, and Munster and Thompson explained their plan for obtaining one to Moore on the flight. They would put her in a Daytona motel and have her make contact with Lee in jail, saying she'd received money from her mother and came down to get the rest of her things. Their phone conversations would be taped, and Moore was to tell Wuornos that authorities had been questioning her family, that she thought the Florida murders would be mistakenly pinned on her, Moore. Munster and Thompson hoped that, out of loyalty to Moore, Wuornos would confess. The first call from Wuornos came on January 14th. She was still under the impression that she was only in jail for the Lori Grody weapons violation. When Moore broached her suspicions, Wuornos reassured her. I'm only in here for that concealed weapons charge in '86 and a traffic ticket, she said. And I tell you what, man, I read the newspapers, and I wasn't one of those little suspects. She was aware, though, that the jailhouse phone was monitored and made efforts to speak of the crimes in code words and to construct alibis. I think someone at work, where you worked at, said something that it looked like us, she said. And it isn't us, see? It's a case of mistaken identity. For 3 days, the calls continued. Moore became more insistent that the police were after her, and it became clear that Wuornos knew what was expected of her. She even voiced suspicion that Moore was not alone, that someone was there taping their conversations. But as time passed, she became less careful about what she said. She would not let Moore go down with her. Just go ahead and let them know what you need to know, what they want to know, or anything, she said, and I will cover for you because you're innocent. I'm not going to let you go to jail. Listen, if I have to confess, I will." And on the morning of January 16th, she did. Wuornos came back to two main points over and over during her confession to Larry Horzipa and Bruce Munster. First, she made it clear that Moore was not involved in any way in any of the murders. Additionally, she was emphatic in her assertion that nothing was her fault, not the murders, and not any circumstance that led her down the criminal path that was her life. All the killings were made in self-defense, she claimed. Each victim had either assaulted her, threatened her, or raped her. Her story seemed to develop as she told it. When she thought she'd said something incriminating, she would back up and retell that part, changing details to suit her overall scenario. She'd been raped several times in the past few years, she claimed, and she had had enough. When each of her victims became aggressive, she killed out of fear. Several times, Michael O'Neill, a public defender from the Volusia County Public Defender's Office, advised Wuornos to stop talking, finally asking in exasperation, "Do you realize these guys are cops?" Wuornos answered, "I know, and they wanted to hang me, and that's cool, because maybe, man, I deserve it. I just want to get this over with." An avalanche of book and movie offers poured into detectives, relatives, Moore, and even Wuornos herself. Wuornos seemed to think she would make millions from her story, not yet realizing that Florida had a law against criminals profiting in such a manner. She was all over the local and national media. She felt famous, and she continued to talk about the crimes with anyone who would listen, including Volusia County Jail employees. With each retelling, she refined her story, casting herself in a better light each time. Into this tumult came Aileen Wuornos, a 44-year-old born-again Christian who ran a horse breeding and boarding facility near Ocala. She had seen Wuornos' picture in the newspaper and wrote her a letter. "My name is Aileen Wuornos," she began. "I'm born again. You're going to think I'm crazy, but Jesus told me to write to you." She provided her home telephone number, and on January 30th, Wuornos called her, collect, for the first time. Almost immediately, Wuornos became her ardent defender and helpmate. Wuornos advised her that her public defenders were trying to profit from her story, as was everyone else. Wuornos asked for and got new attorneys. Wuornos spoke with reporters, describing her relationship with Wuornos to a Vanity Fair reporter as a soul-binding. "We're like Jonathan and David in the Bible. It's as though part of me is trapped in jail with her. We always know what the other is feeling and thinking." To another reporter, she said, "If the world could know the real Aileen Wuornos, there's not a jury that would convict her." Throughout 1991, Wuornos appeared on talk shows and in tabloids, talking to anyone who would listen about what she perceived as Wuornos' true good nature. She arranged interviews for Wuornos with reporters she thought would be sympathetic, and in this forum, Wuornos continued to tell and embellish her fantastic story. Both Wuornos and Wuornos emphasized Wuornos' troubled upbringing, and both leveled accusations of corruption and complicity at anyone who was handy: the agents proffering the book and movie deals, the detectives, the attorneys, and especially Tyria Moore. And just when it seemed things couldn't get any weirder, they did. On November 22, 1991, Aileen Wuornos and her husband legally adopted Aileen Wuornos. Wuornos said God had told her to. Wuornos' attorneys engineered a plea bargain, to which Wuornos agreed, in which she would plead to 6 charges and receive 6 consecutive life terms. One state attorney, however, thought she should receive the death penalty, so on January 14, 1992, Wuornos went to trial for the murder of Richard Mallory. The evidence and witnesses against her were severely damaging. Dr. Arthur Botting, the medical examiner who had autopsied Mallory's body, stated that Mallory had taken between 10 and 20 agonizing minutes to die. Tyria Moore testified that Wuornos had not seemed overly upset, nervous, or drunk when she told her of killing Mallory. 12 men told of encounters with her along Florida's highways over the years. Florida had a law known as the Williams Rule that allowed evidence relating to other crimes to be admitted if it helps to show a pattern. Because of the Williams Rule, information regarding the other killings were presented to the jury. Wuornos' claim of having killed in self-defense would have been a lot more believable had the jury known only of Mallory. Now, with the jury made aware of all the murders, self-defense seemed improbable at best. After the excerpts from her videotape confession were played, the self-defense claim seemed ridiculous. On the tape, Wuornos appeared confident and not at all upset by the story she was telling. She made easy conversation with her interrogators and repeatedly told her public defender to be quiet. Her image spoke from the screen. "I took a life. I am willing to give up my life because I killed people who deserved to die." Tricia Jenkins, one of Wuornos's public defenders, did not want her client to testify and told her so. But Wuornos insisted on telling her story. By now, her account of Mallory's killing barely resembled the one she gave in her confession. Mallory had raped and sodomized her, she claimed, and had tortured her. On cross-examination, prosecutor John Tanner obliterated any shred of credibility she may have had. As he brought to light all of her lies and inconsistencies, she became agitated and angry. Her attorneys repeatedly advised her not to answer questions, and she invoked her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination 25 times. She was the defense's only witness, and when she left the stand, there was not much doubt about how her trial would end. On January 27th, Judge Uriel Blount charged the jury. They returned with their verdict less than 2 hours later. They found Wuornos guilty of first-degree murder, and as they filed out of the courtroom, she exploded with rage, shouting, "I'm innocent! I was raped! I hope you get raped! Scumbags of America!" Her outburst was still fresh in the minds of jurors when the penalty phase of her trial began the next day. Expert witnesses for the defense testified that Wuornos was mentally ill, that she suffered from borderline personality disorder, and that her tumultuous upbringing had stunted and ruined her. Jenkins referred to her client as a damaged, primitive child as she pleaded with the jury to spare Wuornos's life. But jurors neither forgot nor forgave the woman they'd come to know during the trial. With a unanimous verdict, they recommended that Judge Blount sentence her to the electric chair. He did so on January 31st. Wuornos did not stand trial again. On March 31st, 1992, she pleaded no contest to the murders of Dick Humphreys, Troy Burress, and David Spears, saying she wanted to get right with God. In a rambling statement to the court, she said, "I wanted to confess to you that Richard Mallory did violently rape me, as I've told you, but these others did not. They only began to start to." She ended her monologue by turning to Assistant State Attorney Rick Ridgway and hissing, "I hope your wife and children get raped in the..." On May 15th, Judge Thomas Sawaya handed her 3 more death sentences. She made an obscene gesture and muttered, "Mother." In June 1992, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Charles Karskadin, and in November, she received her 5th death sentence. In early February of 1993, she was sentenced to die after pleading guilty to the murder of Walter Gino Antonio. No charges were brought for the murder of Peter Seams, as his body was never found. For a time, there was speculation that Wuornos might receive a new trial for the murder of Richard Mallory. New evidence showed that Mallory had served 10 years in prison for sexual violence, and attorneys felt that jurors would have seen the case differently had they known this fact. No new trial was forthcoming, though. The state Supreme Court of Florida had affirmed all 6 of her death sentences. "I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again," she wrote in a letter to the Florida Supreme Court, which in April agreed to allow her to fire her attorneys and stop her appeals. According to the Associated Press, she was also allowed to choose lethal injection over the electric chair, changing the manner in which she would die. CNN reported that Governor Jeb Bush issued a stay and ordered a mental exam, but lifted the stay in the first week of October 2002 after 3 psychiatrists who interviewed her concluded that she understood she would die and why she was being executed. Associated Press reported that serial killer Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at 9:47 a.m. Wednesday, October 9, 2002, more than a decade after she murdered 6 men along Central Florida highways while working as a prostitute. The execution took place at Florida State Prison near Stark, Florida. Wuornos, 46, was the 10th woman in the U.S. and the second woman in Florida to be executed since the death penalty resumed in 1976, according to the Death Penalty Information Center. 51 men have been executed by Florida between 1976 and October 2002. Judy Buenoano was the other woman executed in Florida during that time span. I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back. Like Independence Day with Jesus, June 6, like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back, Wuornos said from the execution chamber. The rock is a biblical reference to Jesus. For years, Wuornos claimed she shot the men out of self-defense while being raped and sodomized. Later, she recanted her claims, saying she wanted to make peace with God. Wuornos also claimed to have killed a seventh man. Her life story spawned 2 movies, several books, and the opera Wuornos by Carla Lucero. Wuornos gave her last media interview just days before her execution to British producer Nick Broomfield, who did a documentary on her in 1993, but she stormed out after 35 minutes, Broomfield said. My conclusion from the interview is, today we are executing someone who is mad. Here's someone who has totally lost her mind. State Attorney John Tanner, who watched psychiatrist interview her for 30 minutes last week, said she was cognizant and lucid. She knew exactly what she was doing, Tanner said. Serial killer Aileen Wuornos, who confessed to fatally shooting 7 men along the Florida highways, received a lethal injection in October 2002. In an odd twist to the story, despite her 6 death sentences, it was Lee's choice to end her life that day. Her execution was carried out amid a hotbed of controversy about capital punishment in the U.S., with Illinois Governor Ryan at the forefront. Ryan declared a total moratorium on executions in his state after it released its 13th wrongly convicted prisoner. Florida Governor Jeb Bush also stayed some executions. Lee put herself on a different track, however, by becoming that rarity, a volunteer for execution. Had she not, she would likely still be alive, languishing in her Spartan 6-foot by 9-foot cell, barely seeing anyone but prison guards and starved for human touch. She had quite simply had enough. Wanting to die was nothing new for Wuornos, who first voiced her wish to get on with the execution a decade earlier after her first guilty verdict. She wanted to get right with God, she said. Despite some wavering and her lawyer's attempts to dissuade her, she stood firm in that resolve over the years. This, despite her various appellate lawyers' best efforts to talk her out of it. Lee fought for and won the right to fire her counsel. Several psychiatrists also found she fully understood the ramifications of waiving her rights to all further appeals, so the way was clear for her death warrant. For Governor Bush, serial killer Aileen Wuornos' volunteer status was the dealmaker. He held off on signing other death warrants, but signed and let the ink dry on Lee's. Of course, Lee's crimes were never in doubt, thanks to her confession, although some believe there are likely more victims we still don't know about. Where confusion reigned was in her motive. Predator-like, she systematically shot to death and robbed strangers after she flagged them down while hitchhiking and, once in their cars, offered sex. After her arrest, she was almost immediately labeled a man-hating lesbian. The assumption about her sexuality was based on her 4-year love relationship with Tyria Moore, whom she called her wife. Uncannily, Tyria, with her strawberry red hair, freckled face, and stocky build, eerily resembled Leo Pittman, the birth father Lee never met. Yet Lee is better described as bisexual. She had a couple of other girlfriends, but also had sexual and romantic and emotional relationships with men. She chose to be with them, loved some, and instigated sex with men even when there was no payment involved. In 1981, she was so in love with one boyfriend, and so distraught when she believed their relationship was over, that she planned to kill herself, unable to imagine life without him. That day, she got drunk and bought a gun, but instead of turning it on herself, she held up a supermarket while dressed in a bikini. After serving 18 months of her 3-year prison sentence, she went to live with yet another man, one of several prison pen pals. Lee often said she liked sex with men, and her sex life with Tyria waned enough for Tyria to complain to her best friend about it. Lee herself said that her greater love for Tyria wasn't sexual. The real driving force in Lee's life wasn't sex at all. It was a search for an emotional bond and love. Love that she'd never really had, from her abandoning mother, her emotionally and physically abusive grandfather, or, it seems, from the grandmother who failed to protect her from him. Certainly not from the callous young males who had sex with her while she was an adolescent. She was far more familiar with loss than with love, having lost her beloved brother Keith to cancer at age 21 and having her baby son taken away from her after she gave birth at age 15. Lee found the deep emotional bond she desperately craved with Tyria. Her borderline personality disorder carried with it an overwhelming fear of abandonment. I scrutinized closely the violent year during which Lee snuffed out 7 lives. At least 6 of the 7 murder dates matched times when she felt under heightened threat of losing Tyria. That desperate fear might well have been the trigger to rob and kill, what some profilers call the precipitating factor. In Lee's mind, to keep Ty, she needed money. Almost without exception, she killed men with several $100s on them. With her rough, fading looks and prostitution clients harder to find, several $100s was a lot of money to Lee. Her habit was to return home smiling after a murder, waving her ill-gotten gains and promising Tyria that she could now pay the rent, buy the beer, pay for a trip to SeaWorld, pay for them to party, pay for whatever. Later, Lee said that Tyria was greedy and mercenary, and the infusion of cash seemed, until the police net really tightened, to help keep Ty at her side. At least Lee believed it did, and that's what counts. Tyria's sister was staying with her and Lee during one particularly bloody 3-week period when Lee murdered 3 men. The sisters were close, and Lee was rattled, desperately afraid that when the sister returned home to Ohio, Tyria would leave with her. We don't know if Lee got a sexual thrill from taking lives, male serial killer style, although, as a prostitute, her crimes outwardly had a sexual component. Several victims were found naked. It was her killing of at least 3 strangers in different locations, with a cooling-off period between murders, that led to her being called the first female serial killer. As the first woman to fit the FBI guidelines in that regard, she broke the mold. Female multiple murderers typically kill inmates, husbands, and lovers, Black Widow style for monetary gain, or babies, or the weak and infirm. Certainly, Lee liked the power of holding a man's life in her hands. But she was also a robber who killed for practical reasons. She didn't want to leave behind any witnesses. She carried Windex with her gun in her kill bag, ready to wipe away fingerprints and cover her tracks. It's true that Lee hated men, but less acknowledged is that she hated people in general. Most people. She was deeply, uncontrollably angry. Inevitably, her outbursts of rage, ugly moods, and volatile temperament drove away the very people she longed to draw close. Cammie Green, an old friend of Tyria's, whose ID Lee stole, put it this way: "She had a bad attitude. I'm sure a lot of men had hurt her, but it was people in general." Lee died as she lived, pretty much alone. Not only did Tyria betray her love by working with police to trap her into confessing to the murders, but she wouldn't look her in the eye during court appearances. In the end, Lee's adopted mother, Aileen Wuornos, the Christian woman who publicly befriended then adopted her after her arrest, was noticeably absent. Their relationship withstood much turmoil, but eventually soured. Wuornos didn't even know her daughter's execution date. The only constant in Lee's life was her old school friend from Michigan, Dawn, with whom she slept in cars as a teenager. Lee's closest friend in her last years, Dawn was her committed pen pal and sometime visitor, and spent some of Lee's last hours with her on death row. Aileen Wuornos started her life without love, and, save for Dawn's support, ended it the same way.
Marie Hilley is a mystery. Her presence still hovers over her family and friends, and with it, the deeply painful questions with no answers. What made her do such ghastly things? What motivated her complicated stories and alibis? Was there anybody that she truly loved? And finally, who was the real Marie? Those who should have known her best knew her least. In the established tradition of black widows, Marie murdered her husband. It didn't stop there. Her murderous escapades undermined what should have been the most sacred of family relationships. When it appeared she would finally be brought to justice for her crimes, she disappeared and began life anew with an assumed identity. One persona after another, discarded when it no longer suited her needs. The story of Marie Hilley is a study of deceit, pathological obsession, and serial murder. Improbably, Marie Hilley was not the only black widow of note from the tiny mill town of Blue Mountain, Alabama. In the 1950s, Americans were shocked at the criminal exploits of Nanny Hazel Doss, a sweet-looking woman whose jovial manner during her lurid confessions earned her the nickname the Giggling Grandma. Nanny Doss, who was raised in Blue Mountain and later moved to Oklahoma, killed 11 people, including 5 husbands, 2 of her children, and her mother. Marie Hilley's tally of victims wasn't nearly as prodigious as Nanny Doss's, but her dark shadow loomed larger over Blue Mountain than Doss's ever had. Marie Hilley's Alabama was not one of plantations and verandas and mint juleps. North Alabama, where the Appalachian Mountains finally play themselves out, is a rockier, less agriculturally hospitable place than the more cotton-friendly areas further south. The cotton with which Marie would have been familiar was processed in the textile mills of Blue Mountain and Anniston, the bustling industrial town on the outskirts of which Blue Mountain lay. Calhoun County, which encompasses both towns, was full of hard-working people who had never known the fabled leisurely life for which the South was known. Hughie Fraser and Lucille Meads worked just as hard as everybody else. Each came from a family whose life was centered on the local mills. And when they married in January 1932, each was already accustomed to the long hours of labor required just to make a living in Depression-era Alabama. When her daughter, Audrey Marie, was born on June 4, 1933, Lucille Fraser held no illusions about staying home to care for the child. She returned to her job at Linen Thread Company as soon as she could, and relatives cared for Marie while her parents worked long shifts. The Frasers loved Marie. There was never any doubt of that. But they were, like the folks around them, realists. Times were hard, and a single income didn't stretch far enough to meet the needs of a family of 3. Hughie and Lucille loved and trusted their families and were grateful for the help, and they tried to make up for the lost time with Marie by spoiling her. Marie's clothes weren't the best money could buy, but they were pretty and neat, and better than those of a lot of the kids around her. And from an early age, Marie got her way. The slightest correction or denial was likely to provoke a loud tantrum. The Frasers, perhaps out of guilt, never saw fit to administer any real discipline. The Frasers saw a brighter future for Marie than their own. Their daughter, they proudly predicted, wouldn't have to spend countless years breathing the linty, stifling air of the mills. She would graduate high school and be a secretary, a humble ambition that seemed, in the context of the Frasers' times and surroundings, the loftiest of dreams. Blue Mountain girls usually got no more than a grade school education before they began working at Linen Thread. Marie would be different. She was special, and her parents told her so. In 1945, the Frasers moved from Blue Mountain to Anniston, and Marie began 7th grade at Quintard Junior High School. Anniston, though geographically close to Blue Mountain, was socially worlds away. Anniston had its own upper class, comprised chiefly of the owners of the various mills and factories where Marie's relatives had always worked. At Quintard, Marie found herself among children of privilege, and she cultivated friendships with them. She joined the student council and was serious about her studies, earning a reputation for maturity and intelligence. She was pretty, too, and well-dressed, and by the end of her 7th grade year, she'd been chosen prettiest girl at Quintard by the Anniston High School yearbook staff. Her successes continued at Anniston High. Marie joined the Future Teachers of America and the Commercial Club, an organization for girls who planned secretarial careers. Her seriousness established her among her peers as a girl with depth and dependability. Her looks and style made the boys look twice, and while she enjoyed the attention, she was already spoken for. Marie was Frank Hilley's girl. Frank Hilley was from an Anniston family whose men worked in the area's other big industry, pipe making. Clarence and Carrie Hilley had a close, warm family, and what Frank and his two sisters, Frida and Jewel, may have lacked in material things, they more than made up for in love. Though Frank had a bit of a temper, he was loyal and reliable, and while he wouldn't turn away from the occasional scrap, he actually preferred not to get dirty. He met Marie when she was 12, and he was a junior in high school, and by the time he graduated, he was smitten with her. Marie, against her parents' wishes, returned his affection. Though he wasn't from one of Anniston's moneyed families, Frank treated her like royalty. He was jealous of the other boys' attention toward her, and he did his best to keep his temperamental girl happy. Like most young couples, they had intense, dramatic arguments, but they always made up. When Frank went into the Navy after high school, he pined for Marie and counted the days until they could be together again. He'd been assigned to Guam, and the distance and time away were unbearable. Afraid of losing Marie, he married her while he was on leave in May 1951. Marie stayed behind in Anniston to finish high school while Frank went to Long Beach, California, to finish out his stint in the Navy. Marie joined him there after her graduation and later accompanied him when he was reassigned to Boston in 1952. At the end of his tour of duty, they discovered Marie was pregnant, and when he was discharged, they moved back home to Anniston, where they bought a small home. Frank got a job in the shipping department of Standard Foundry, while Marie worked as a secretary. Their first child, Michael Hilley, was born on November 11, 1952. Outwardly, the Hilleys seemed happy and settled, but the first stirrings of trouble had already begun. Marie liked to spend money. When Frank had sent home his paychecks from California, Marie had spent them with astonishing speed, and when the time came for her to join him out west, she had no money with which to make the trip. Her in-laws had to pay her way. These habits didn't abate, and though Frank liked to make Marie happy, he found it hard to keep pace with her constant acquisitions of newer and nicer clothes and furnishings. There were arguments, but Frank didn't like to fight and found it easier to go along with Marie's whims, as best he could, rather than to bicker over every purchase. Besides, he loved his wife. By the time Carol Hilley was born in 1960, Frank had been appointed foreman of the shipping department at Standard Foundry, and Marie had a reputation as an excellent executive secretary. Though the family's collective income had increased, it still barely kept pace with Marie's spending. And Marie was developing a disturbing work pattern. Though her employers always found her professional and effective at her duties, her co-workers thought otherwise. Marie judged and put on airs and played power games, but was always careful to remain respectful and subservient to the boss. At each job, she eventually became unpopular with those around her and left, telling friends and family that she'd been ganged up on by her fellow employees. Her references were always excellent, though, and she never had trouble getting another job. Marie worked for some of the most powerful men in Anniston, all of whom spoke glowingly of her. Later, Frank Hilley would find out one of the reasons why. As the years passed, Anniston citizens grew to know the Hilleys. Frank was a member of the Elks Club and the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and though he liked to tie one on now and then, he was well liked around town. Marie was active in the First Christian Church and volunteered at her kids' schools. Some found her peculiar, and some noted that she reacted badly when she didn't get her way, but mostly people dismissed her quirks, attributing them to a high-strung nature. Carol and Mike Hilley wanted for nothing except, perhaps, their mother's attention. Like her own parents, Marie showered her children with material possessions, but remained emotionally remote. She administered little discipline, leaving that task to Frank's mother, Carrie, who cared for the children while Marie and Frank worked. Marie favored Mike and allowed him to grow into a little hellion, brushing off his behavior with a casual, boys will be boys attitude. As for Carol, she seemed always to be missing the mark. Carol was a tomboy, nothing like the demure, proper daughter Marie wanted. They clashed continually. Frank Hilley, noticing the effect Marie's treatment was having, took a special interest in Carol, taking her for ice cream and to football games. Their close relationship galled Marie. From time to time, Frank worried about his wife. Sometimes she would be awake all night, and he would hold her while she shook in nameless fear. She was restless, and he was unable to soothe her. She taunted him with love letters she said she received from local men. And then there was her spending. Marie's refined tastes kept the bills coming to the Hilley home year after year. Sometimes Frank would reprimand her, but it did no good. Marie wanted the best, and she wanted it now. She rented a post office box and began having some bills routed there so Frank wouldn't know what she was spending. And she began taking out loans. In Anniston, a town of less than 30,000 people, Frank Hilley was respected, and businesses extended credit to his wife out of courtesy. Frank had always paid every bill on time, so when his wife's accounts came past due, creditors took notice. This wasn't like Frank. By the fall of 1974, Frank couldn't ignore the troubles in his home any longer. Word of his wife's credit arrangements leaked back to him through the grapevine. Worse still, he came home sick from work one day to find Marie in bed with her employer, Walter Clinton. Frank told his son, who was married by now and attending Atlanta Christian College, of these latest developments. He didn't mention, though, his increasingly failing health. Frank was sick a lot during 1974. At first, he attributed his weariness and periodic bouts of nausea and vomiting to something he'd eaten or to exposure to chemicals at the foundry. He took Alka-Seltzer and bore his symptoms as best he could. But his illness persisted, and by May of 1975, he was ready to consult a doctor. Dr. Jones, the family's physician, first prescribed fluids, then kaopectate and Maalox, then an antispasmodic medication. Nothing helped. When Frank's sister, Frida Adcock, visited him on May 22nd, he told her he was sicker than he'd ever been and that he feared he'd die. He also told her that Marie had, on Dr. Jones's orders, given him an injection. At the time, Frida thought nothing of it. At 3:30 the following morning, Marie found Frank wandering the yard in his underwear. She took him to the hospital, where tests showed that his liver had failed. Dr. Jones changed his diagnosis to one of infectious hepatitis and prescribed new medications. Frank's condition worsened. He was jaundiced, hallucinating, and very agitated. It was all Mike Hilley could do to keep his father from jumping out the window. At around 4 a.m. on May 25th, Mike left the hospital to pick up his grandmothers and bring them to see Frank. When he returned about an hour later, he found his mother asleep and his father dead. The official cause of death was infectious hepatitis, and Frank Hilley was buried on May 27, 1975. Mike Hilley preached the sermon at his father's funeral. Frank Hilley's autopsy report stated that he died of natural causes, so Marie had no trouble collecting on the life insurance he'd bought through Standard Foundry. The total of Frank's policies was around $31,000. Not enough to make a woman wealthy, but still a nice windfall. Marie began spending. For herself, she bought a car, clothes, and jewelry. Her mother, Lucille, got a diamond ring. Mike and his wife, Terry, received appliances and clothes, while Carol Hilley got a car, a stereo, furniture, and countless other gifts. But those closest to Marie noticed that the constant acquisitions did nothing to quiet her increasing restlessness. Marie was dissatisfied. She complained to several people that no one in her family loved her, least of all Carol, with whom she was constantly engaged in a battle of wills. She complained about her boss and her job, and about a string of petty thefts at her home she said began before Frank's death. Marie gathered her family about her. Lucille had been diagnosed with cancer soon after Frank died, and Marie brought her into her home to care for her. She also extended an invitation to Mike and Terry for them to live with her. Mike had a job as an assistant pastor at Indian Oaks Church and appreciated his mother's offer, relishing the idea of having his family close while he began his career in the ministry. He and Terry accepted, but soon regretted their decision. Marie and Carol fought constantly, and his mother's demands for his time and attention wore Mike down. On top of that, Terry was often ill with stomach trouble. During the time she and Mike lived with Marie, Terry was in the hospital 4 different times and had a miscarriage. Her health problems only added to the tension in the Hilley home. He and Terry found an apartment. But the night before they were set to move out, Marie's house caught fire. Marie, Lucille, and Carol moved into the new apartment until repairs could be completed. When the time came for them to move back home, the apartment next door to Mike and Terry's caught fire, forcing the couple to move back in with Marie until they could find new housing. When they finally succeeded in moving away from Marie, a strange new series of events began. Lucille Fraser died in January 1977. In the following months, the Anniston Police Department became increasingly familiar with Marie Hilley. The petty thefts had continued, she told police. She reported gas leaks and claimed she found a small fire in her closet late one night. Neighbor Doris Ford, to whose house Marie had a key, found a similar fire in her own hall closet but had no idea who could have set it. Both Marie and Doris Ford reported harassing phone calls. Police responded to dozens of complaints from both Marie Hilley and Doris Ford. Every officer was familiar with Marie, and at least one took that familiarity a few steps further. Officer Billy Atherson fell for the beleaguered but charming widow, and the two began a sexual relationship. Increasingly restive, Marie, with Carol in tow, moved in with Mike and Terry in their new home in Pompano Beach, Florida. It was 1978, and Carol had just graduated from high school. Marie got an office job and returned home late most nights, but her nervous presence and well-established spending habits made life difficult in the Hilley home. Upon her arrival in Pompano Beach, she had run up $600 worth of charges on Mike's Visa card, saying she would reimburse him later. She and Carol still fought. Though Marie occasionally helped with household chores and with Mike and Terry's new baby, they were relieved when she and Carol moved back to Anniston after a few months. Meanwhile, Marie had been buying insurance. There were several policies, including fire insurance, cancer coverage, and life insurance coverage on herself. But Marie also insured the lives of her children. Mike was insured for $25,000, while Carol, through 2 policies, was insured for $39,000. Upon their return to Anniston, Marie and Carol moved in first with Frank's sister Frida, then with his mother Carrie Hilley. The strange occurrences began again: small fires, cut phone lines, and, increasingly, a tendency in Carrie Hilley towards nausea and vomiting. Marie got a job at Dresser Industries and also worked nights for Harold Dillard, the owner of a local construction company. She also began a manipulative, twisted affair designed to bring Dillard under her spell and make him leave his marriage. Almost simultaneously, she began another affair with Calvin Robertson, an old school friend who had long since relocated to San Francisco. She told Robertson that she had cancer and couldn't afford the treatments she needed. He sent money, and she soon returned news that she'd been cured. When he came to visit her in Anniston, he was like a schoolboy, and by the time he left, he was convinced he would die for Marie Hilley. He wasn't ready to leave his wife quite yet, though. Carol Hilley first became ill in April 1979. Now 19 and a freshman at a nearby college, she returned to her high school for its annual junior-senior prom. The night's festivities included the usual young adult diversions: food, drink, a little marijuana, and as the party wore on, Carol became nauseated. It wasn't serious enough to impinge upon her gaiety, so she ignored it, concentrating on having a good time. The following day, though, the nausea returned with a vengeance. Carol left church services early and vomited in the parking lot. On returning home, she discovered that her grandmother, Carrie Hilley, was in the hospital after fainting at church. Carol accompanied Marie to the hospital, where she was sick all afternoon. After that, Carol Hilley would not be completely well again for a long, long time. Over the summer, she grew sicker and weaker. But she was still feisty, and although she was becoming increasingly dependent on Marie's care, she insisted on moving into her own apartment. Marie was a constant presence there, expressing concern and acting as Carol's caretaker. She administered Carol's various medicines and cooked for her. She took her to several doctors, none of whom was able to explain with any certainty what Carol's torturous symptoms meant. The nausea and vomiting, now almost constant, were accompanied by tingling sensations in her hands and feet and ever-worsening muscle weakness. Lieutenant Gary Carroll had grown familiar, even friendly, with Marie Hilley in 1977 when she'd been in almost constant contact with the Anniston Police Department with reports of suspicious fires and phone calls. From his dealings with her, he had sized her up as a financially and emotionally troubled but likable widow. Now he was heading her investigation. On September 26th, he conducted and taped a 2-hour interview with Marie. Mostly, she dodged accusations and tried to lay blame and suspicion elsewhere. But with careful questioning, Carol got her to admit that she'd given Carol injections both at home and in the hospital, and that she'd also given her mother injections. All of these, she claimed, were actually medicine, and she'd obtained one of Carol's injections from a woman at Caraway Methodist named Mrs. Hill, whose daughter was a nurse there. Subsequent developments were stunningly rapid as Carol's poisoning had been agonizingly slow. Frank Hilley's body was exhumed on October 3, 1979. 3 days later, Frida Adcock searched the house where Marie and Carol had lived with Carrie Hilley and found a pill bottle half full of liquid. Tests proved the liquid was arsenic. Arsenic was also found in a pill bottle Marie had in her purse when she was arrested. Evidence mounted, and Marie was charged with the attempted murder of her daughter. Meanwhile, the toxicology reports from Frank Hilley's exhumation came back. Arsenic was present in his tissues at many times the normal level, though it was too soon to tell conclusively if the poison had been the cause of his death. The day after the toxicology reports were released, Lucille Fraser's body was exhumed. Arsenic in her tissues ranged from 4 to 10 times the normal level, though it was cancer that finally killed her. Marie's bail was remarkably low, considering the seriousness of the main charge against her. 5 residents, at the ambivalent request of Mike Hilley, put up the $10,000 bail for the attempted murder charge and $2,000 for each of the check charges, for a total of $14,000. Marie was released on bond on November 11, 1979, and Wilfred Lane, her attorney, took her to Birmingham to stay at a motel. In the coming days, she claimed she was afraid of reprisals from Frank's sisters and asked to be moved to another motel, from which she made numerous phone calls to Mike and other relatives asking for money. On November 18th, when Wilfred Lane and his wife came to the motel to visit Marie, they discovered she was missing. Marie's clothes were strewn about the room, her suitcase lay on the floor, and her purse had been emptied onto a bed. All that seemed missing were her wallet, credit cards, and checkbook. A note scrawled on motel stationery read, "Lane, you led me straight to her. You will hear from me." On that same day, Carrie Hilley died of cancer in Anniston. Tests done on strands of her hair in the previous weeks had indicated elevated arsenic levels. Marie Hilley was now suspected of poisoning at least 4 people. Marie's trail went cold almost immediately. On November 19th, Margaret Key, Marie's aunt, found that her house had been burglarized. Her car was missing, as were some clothes and a suitcase. A note at the scene said the car could be found in nearby Gadsden, and that the burglars would not bother Margaret Key anymore. The car was found a few days later in Marietta, Georgia. The FBI then joined the pursuit, tracking Marie from Marietta through Georgia to Savannah, where she was reported to have left a motel with a man. After that, there was nothing. Most fugitives are eventually apprehended because of their old habits. Something or someone in their past draws them to someplace familiar, where police, having studied the fugitive's history, are waiting. Marie had no sentimental ties to bind her. She just disappeared. Back in Anniston, the final toxicology reports from Frank Hilley's exhumation had come in. Marie was indicted on January 11th, 1980, for the murder of her husband. It's frustratingly unclear whether Marie Hilley knew John Homan before she claimed to have met him in Fort Lauderdale in 1980. She had taunted both Harold Dillard and Calvin Robertson with tales of a John Romans, whom she claimed she would marry, though she didn't love him. Carol remembered that her mother had mentioned a John Ronan who taught at Emory University in Decatur, Georgia. But according to both Marie and John, they met in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in February of 1980. Marie was now going by an alias. She called herself Lindsay Robbie Hannon, and she hinted to John, the 33-year-old owner of a boat-building business, that her past was tragic. She was 35 and from Texas, she told him, and she'd lost both her children in a car accident. John Homan's own life was no picnic. His alcoholic mother died when he was young, and he was an awkward, shy man. He was recently divorced, and Marie's solicitous attentions soothed him. By March, they had moved in together. Using a fictitious resume, Marie got a job as a secretary at an accounting firm in West Palm Beach. She didn't stay long, though. In October, she and John left Florida for New Hampshire, where John's brother, Peter, lived. Marie and John rented a tiny house in Marlow, New Hampshire. John found work at Findings Incorporated, which made small parts for jewelry. Marie got a customer service job at Central Screw Corporation in nearby Keene, New Hampshire, where her efficiency and southern charm enabled her to excel. Her co-workers found her fascinating. As Robbie, she told them of her children's tragic death, of life in a wealthy Texas family, and of an inheritance which she would eventually claim. And she seemed rather frail. She complained of severe headaches and said she'd been to many doctors to try to find relief, but to no avail. Though some of her co-workers found her abrasive and pushy, most considered her a sympathetic figure. The men, especially, found the woman they knew as Robbie Homan to be earthy and fun to be with. As her tenure at Central Screw lengthened, Marie's stories grew more involved. She was dying, she told those around her, of a rare blood disease that caused her body to make too many red blood cells. Though she and John were now married, she left her husband alone from time to time, telling her co-workers she was seeking treatment out of town from various specialists. She began to speak in detail of a sister, her twin, whom she called Terry Martin. Occasionally, she would shut herself into an office at work, saying she was phoning Terry, who was having marriage problems and needed her. It was Terry, she said, who would take care of her during her upcoming trip to Texas. She was making one last attempt to find a treatment for the illness that appeared to be making her increasingly more ill. Her husband would remain in New Hampshire and work. Terry would see to her needs. Marie left Marlow in September 1982 and only stayed in Texas a few days. On September 23rd, she arrived in Pompano Beach, Florida. That day, she had her hair bleached, then went to an employment agency seeking work under the name Terry Martin. By the end of the day, she had secured a secretarial position at Solar Testing Service. She worked there for 6 weeks, telling her new boss, Jack McKenzie, about her twin sister Robbie, who was gravely ill. Her sister had recently suffered a stroke and developed cancer, she claimed, and Terry felt responsible for her. When Mackenzie received a call in mid-November from his secretary, claiming that she was in New Hampshire and her sister had died, he wasn't surprised. She told him she'd be remaining in New Hampshire and thanked him for his kindness. On November 10th, Marie, now assuming the role of Terry, called John Homan to break the news that his wife Robbie had died. The next day, she flew to New Hampshire. John Homan claims to have believed Marie Hilley's new ruse until the moment she was apprehended. Her hair was still bleached, and during her stay in Florida, she had lost quite a lot of weight. As Terry, she carried herself differently, so it's at least somewhat believable that John, insecure and highly suggestible, was fooled. The day after her arrival, she and John went to the office of the Keene Sentinel to place Robbie Homan's obituary. The short piece contains several fabricated details, which would finally be Marie's undoing. They later went to Central Screw, where Marie introduced herself to Robbie's former co-workers as Terry, the twin sister they'd heard so much about. Some there believed her, others weren't fooled for a second. The speculation began. Terry Martin moved in with John Homan, claiming they needed to be together to get over Robbie's death. She got a job just across the state line in Brattleboro, Vermont, at Book Press, a book printing company. Like her sister Robbie, Terry was a competent secretary. She settled into her new job comfortably, and for a while, things seemed quiet. Back at Central Screw, though, the controversy raged. Was she, or wasn't she? A group of doubters decided to focus on the obituary. They first discovered that the hospital to which Robbie's body had supposedly been left, Medical Research Institute of Texas, did not exist. Then they found that the church to which the obituary stated Robbie had belonged in Texas was fictitious as well. A check of obituaries and coroner's records in the Dallas area around the date of November 10, 1982, yielded nothing. The doubting Central Screw employees took their findings to manager Ron Oja, who began some checking of his own. His efforts also produced no corroborating evidence for the assertions in the obituary. The gossip about this amateur investigation spread through Central Screw and into the Keene community, and it wasn't long before local police were informed that something wasn't right about the woman who claimed to be Terry Martin. Detective Bob Hardy of the Keene Police Department started by interviewing the workers from Central Screw, then made some phone calls of his own. Again, nothing in the obituary added up. Hardy began making inquiries with other law enforcement agencies. The New Hampshire State Police told him something interesting. A woman named Carol Manning, who fit Terry Martin's description, was wanted for bank robbery. Authorities began watching Terry. They soon decided she was not Carol Manning, but thought she must be Terry Lynn Clifton, another fugitive. On January 12, 1983, they apprehended her at Book Press. When they asked her name, her answer puzzled them. She was Audrey Marie Hilley, she claimed, and she was wanted in Alabama on bad check charges. When police put her name out on the wire, the word came back quickly. She was indeed Audrey Marie Hilley, but she had more than just check charges to face back in Alabama. Authorities brought Marie back to Anniston on January 19, 1983. By now, another charge had been added, the murder of Frank Hilley, and Marie's bond was set at $320,000. This time, no one stepped forward to pay it. Carol Hilley, now physically recovered from her ordeal, had conflicting emotions but was anxious to see her mother. When Carol visited the jail, Marie cried and hugged her and professed to love her. She missed her terribly during her flight, she claimed. However, she offered no explanation for the poisoning. After that first visit, Marie and Carol saw each other often and spoke on the phone frequently. Carol wanted badly to believe that her mother had never meant to hurt her, which worried prosecutors. They needed Carol's testimony. Judge Sam Monk presided over the trial. Assistant District Attorney Joe Hubbard was the prosecutor, and Wilfred Lane and Thomas Harmon defended Marie. From the beginning, it was obvious that the defense was going to sully Carol's reputation, to make her seem unstable enough to poison herself. "We expect," Harmon said, "the evidence to show that Carol Hilley had used drugs extensively, and that Carol Hilley is, in fact, either homosexual or has engaged in homosexuality. In addition, we expect the evidence to show that Carol Hilley has, on at least 3 occasions, attempted suicide." Carol's performance under cross-examination, though, was admirable. Yes, she had smoked pot, but no, she wasn't a drug addict. Yes, she had engaged in homosexual acts, but no, she wasn't mentally unbalanced because of it. Yes, she had tried to kill herself, but the attempt before her mother was arrested was almost laughable. She'd taken a total of 5 Tylenol. The other attempts occurred when she was trying to deal with the physical and emotional torment caused by the poisoning. Prosecutors needn't have worried. Carol's testimony that her mother had given her mysterious injections during her illness rang lucid and true. Frida Adcock's testimony served to establish that arsenic had been found among Marie's possessions. In addition to the pill bottle she'd found at Carrie Hilley's home, Frida later found a bag containing jars of baby food, a spoon, and a bottle of rat poison that contained arsenic. Defense attorneys objected that these items, as well as the bottle Gary Carroll had found in Marie's purse after her arrest, had been seized illegally and should not be allowed into evidence. Judge Monk overruled them. Frida also testified that Frank Hilley told her that Marie had given him an injection, and Eve Cole corroborated Carol's claim that her mother had given her injections. Still, Marie's attorneys claimed that Carol had poisoned herself and that Frida Adcock's testimony was false. Frida had always hated Marie, the defense claimed, and she would say anything to see her put away for good. But Wilfred Lane and Thomas Harmon were in for a shock. Marie had told her attorneys that Gary Carroll had interviewed her after her 1979 arrest, but she hadn't told them that the interview had been taped. In that recording, Marie admitted to giving Carroll 2 injections, saying they were anti-nausea medicine, and claiming to have obtained one from a woman she had met at the hospital. She also admitted that she might be mentally ill, that she might need some help. Marie could not claim she'd never said such things. They were all there on the tape. From that point, her defense crumbled. Even Mike Hilley's testimony, which seemed to contradict some of the prosecution's key points, was of no help. On cross-examination, Joe Hubbard got Mike to admit Marie's rampant financial difficulties and to his own sudden violent illnesses, which appeared to be connected with Marie. His letter to the Calhoun County coroner, which he had assumed would remain confidential, was brought into evidence. "It's my belief," he'd written, "that she probably injected my dad with arsenic, as she has apparently done to my sister." Like his mother, Mike Hilley could not deny his own prior statements. It took the jury just 3 hours to come to its verdict. Marie Hilley was guilty of the murder of Frank Hilley and of the attempted murder of Carol Hilley. The following day, she received a life sentence for the murder and 20 years for the poisoning. At the sentencing hearing, she again professed her innocence. On June 9, 1983, Marie entered Tutwiler State Women's Prison in Wetumpka, Alabama. She was assigned a job as a data processor and was classified as a medium security prisoner. Despite reports that she talked constantly of escape and had reportedly made plans for a breakout, she was reclassified in 1985 as a minimum security prisoner, which made her eligible for passes and leaves from the prison. In late 1986, her first 8-hour pass was approved. That pass and 3 others came and went with no trouble. Marie returned to Tutwiler promptly each time, and by February 1987, she had qualified for a 3-day furlough. On February 19th, she left Tutwiler prison for the last time. John Homan had relocated to Anniston, and he and Marie spent the weekend in a hotel room there. On Sunday morning, she told John that she wanted to visit her parents' graves and would meet him at 10:00 a.m. at a local restaurant. She wasn't there. Returning to the hotel room, John found a note. "I hope you will be able to forgive me," it read. "I'm getting ready to leave. It will be best for everyone. We'll be together again. Please give me an hour to get out of town." Marie wrote that a man named Walter was taking her out of town and that she would fly to Canada to contact John later. John called the sheriff. Given Marie's history, authorities assumed she had a well-crafted plan of escape and had left the state quickly. No one expected what happened next. It was rainy and cold on February 26th when police were called to a house near Blue Mountain. A strange, delirious woman was on Sue Craft's porch, and she needed help. She said her name was Sellers and that her car had broken down. She was suffering from hypothermia. Sue Craft did not recognize the woman as Marie Hilley, though she had known Marie years before. Within a few minutes, Marie lost consciousness and began convulsing, and her heart stopped in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. No one knew how long she'd been wandering, but her body temperature had fallen to 81 degrees. Marie Hilley, who had always aspired to wealth and position, died an ugly, lonely death very near her childhood home. On February 28, 1987, Marie Hilley's children buried her beside Frank Hilley, the husband she'd murdered. In Anniston, the speculation continues to this day. Was there indeed someone who had agreed to help Marie escape, only to back out at the last minute? If so, who was it, and why did he suddenly back out of the plan? Where was Marie for the 4 days she was missing? Mostly, though, they wonder what drove Marie Hilley to do the things she did. Who was Marie Hilley? No one knows for sure.
Young Charles Cotton was dead. The doctor couldn't deny that. His stepmother, Mary Ann Cotton, claimed the 7-year-old boy had died from gastric fever. Still, the neighbors had noticed that a few too many in the Cotton household had died by similar stomach ailments in recent months. Gossip and suspicion ran rampant through the West Auckland neighborhood in County Durham, England. Slowly, the investigators and gossips began looking into the background of 40-year-old Mary Ann. The deeper they dug, the more Mary Ann's life looked like something out of a Gothic horror novel. A childhood of near abuse and near poverty, an early marriage to flee an unkind stepfather, and a long string of family members who had succumbed to the mysterious gastric fever or other curious circumstances, while Mary Ann was ominously close by. In his book, Mary Ann Cotton, Her Story and Trial, researcher Arthur Appleton notes that Mary Ann Robson, born in the small English village of Low Moorsley in October of 1832, did not have a happy childhood, but neither did most children born in lower-class England in the early 19th century. Mary Ann's father was ardently religious, a fierce disciplinarian of Mary Ann and her younger brother Robert, and active in the choir and activities of the local Methodist church. No doubt, his daughter feared him and his punishments. When Mary Ann was 8, her parents moved the family to the town of Merton, and her father continued working in the mines until one day, about a year after their move, when he fell down a mine shaft to an early death. As Dickens would repeatedly chronicle in his classic writings, life for a lower-class family, especially one headed by a newly widowed woman, was extremely harsh in 19th century England. The specter of being sent to a workhouse or being separated from her mother and brother cast dark shadows over Mary Ann's girlhood and was the cause of many nightmares. Mary Ann never went into the workhouse, however, because her mother remarried. Her new stepfather did not like Mary Ann, and the feeling was mutual. Mary Ann began looking for an escape from her childhood home, although she owed one thing to her stepfather. His salary had kept her and her family from becoming homeless and destitute. At an early age, Mary Ann learned to avoid the miserable fate of her nightmares, and she had to keep a steady flow of money coming her way, no matter what the method. Perhaps partly to escape the daily life with her stepfather, Mary Ann left home at the age of 16 to work as a servant in a prosperous household in South Hetton. Mary Ann's work quality caused no complaint, although she began what would become a life riddled with sexual scandals. Soon after Mary Ann began working in the household, the South Hetton gossips were busy spreading tales about illicit meetings between Mary Ann and a local churchman. After 3 years of service in South Hetton, Mary Ann left to train as a dressmaker and to marry a miner named William Mowbray, by whom she had become pregnant. After their wedding in July of 1852, the newlyweds moved around England as William got work at various mining sites and on railroad construction projects throughout England. In the first 4 years of their marriage, William and Mary Ann had 5 children, although 4 of them died in infancy or soon after. Even though child mortality rates were high at the time, this was a bit extreme. However, Mary Ann and William were probably viewed as particularly unlucky parents, suffering from grievous personal losses. Mary Ann and William did not have a happy marriage. They frequently argued about money, as Mary Ann was still obsessed about never becoming poor. The quarrels grew so heated that William, in an apparent attempt to get some peace, landed a job on the steamer Newburn out of Sunderland and was often away from home. Mary Ann and the surviving children followed him and took up residence in Sunderland, and the number of her children lost to indefinable illnesses continued at an alarming rate. In January of 1865, William returned to the house to nurse an injured foot, and Mary Ann helped him recover. Later that month, despite a doctor's care, William died from a sudden intestinal disorder, which he had not shown evidence of before benefiting from Mary Ann's care. Soon after William's death, the doctor went to the Mowbray house to console the grieving widow, but was surprised to find Mary Ann dancing around the room in a new dress she had bought with the money from William's life insurance. Soon after William Mowbray's death, Mary Ann moved her remaining children to Seaham Harbour, where she struck up a relationship with Joseph Nattrass, a local man who was engaged to another woman. Apparently unable to break up the engagement, Mary Ann left Seaham Harbour after Nattrass's wedding and after bearing her 3.5-year-old daughters, leaving her with 1 living child out of 9 she had given birth to. Nattrass would reappear in Mary Ann's life several years later. Mary Ann decided to return to Sunderland and found employment at the Sunderland Infirmary, House of Recovery for the Cure of Contagious Fever, Dispensary, and Humane Society. Her remaining child, Isabella, was sent to live with her maternal grandmother and would remain in her grandmother's care for more than 2 years. At the Sunderland Infirmary, Mary Ann kept the wards clean with a mixture of soap and arsenic, and the infirmary staff admired her diligence and friendliness with the patients. She chatted with many of them, but one in particular, engineer George Ward, took a fancy to Mary Ann. Soon after he was discharged from the infirmary, he and Mary Ann were married at a church in Monk Wearmouth in August of 1865. Although now settled into a new marriage and a steady household, Mary Ann did not fetch Isabella from her mother's house. Despite having been released from the infirmary, George Ward developed health problems soon after marrying Mary Ann, and despite various treatments by his doctors, he died in October of 1866 after a long bout of paralysis in his limbs and chronic stomach problems. The doctor attending George was accused of incorrectly treating his patient, a point of view that Mary Ann actively encouraged, probably hoping to redirect any doubts away from herself. Much later, at Mary Ann's trial, people would wonder why nobody became suspicious of this woman who left a trail of husbands and children dead from startlingly similar illnesses over a very short time. But as Mary Ann had different doctors attend to her dying family and frequently relocated, suspicions were never built in a single community. According to her pattern, after George Ward's death in Sunderland, Mary Ann needed to move on. Pallian shipwright James Robinson needed a housekeeper to care for his house and children after the death of his wife, Hannah. In November of 1866, Mary Ann applied for the position and was hired. 2 days before Christmas, the family's baby was interred after developing a gastric fever, perhaps not surprisingly. Overcome with the grief of his wife's recent death and then of his infant son, James turned to Mary Ann for solace and support. She provided comfort and apparently then some, as she was soon pregnant with Robinson's child. A new marriage seemed to be in the forecast, but Mary Ann was diverted in March of 1867 by her mother's sudden illness. Mary Ann returned to her mother's home to help nurse the elderly lady back to health. As always, one of Mary Ann's first tasks was to clean the house from top to bottom with soap and, her favorite cleaning additive, arsenic, of which she usually had an ample supply. By the time Mary Ann arrived, however, her mother was doing much better. Still, Mary Ann decided to stay and look after her anyway and visit her daughter Isabella, who was still living with her grandmother. Soon after being in Mary Ann's care, her mother began complaining of stomach pains and died only 9 days after Mary Ann's arrival. Returning to the Robinson household with her mother, young Isabella, who had enjoyed a life of good health while living away from Mary Ann, soon developed an incapacitating stomach ailment, as did 2 of Robinson's children, and all 3 were buried within 2 weeks of each other at the end of April. James Robinson must have grieved further over the loss of 2 more of his children, but apparently did not suspect any wrongdoing on Mary Ann's part. He put his mourning aside in time for his wedding to Mary Ann in early August, at which Mary Ann stated her surname as Mowbray. Apparently, her 14-month marriage to George Ward had slipped her mind. The couple's first child, Mary Isabella, was born in late November, but had succumbed to illness by the 1st of March of 1868. James now began to become suspicious of his new wife, not only by the frequency of deaths in the household since Mary Ann's arrival, but also by her constant requests for money and her pressing desire for him to ensure his life. Always punctual in his household finances, James was surprised when he received letters from his building society and his brother-in-law detailing debts Mary Ann had run up without his knowledge. He questioned his remaining children and found that their new stepmother had convinced them to pawn valuables from the house and give her the money. Enraged, he threw Mary Ann out of the house, and she left, taking their young daughter with her. In late 1869, after wandering the streets in a kind of life that Mary Ann had anxiously feared, Mary Ann and her daughter visited an acquaintance. During the course of the visit, Mary Ann asked her friend to watch the girl while she went out to mail a letter. Mary Ann never came back, and the daughter was returned to James on the first day of 1870. After weeks of desperate living, the year 1870 began well for Mary Ann. Her friend Margaret Cotton introduced her to her brother Frederick. Like James Robinson, Frederick was a recent widower and had lost 2 of his 4 children to early deaths. His sons Frederick Jr. and Charles were all that was left of his family. His sister acted as a mother substitute for the family. However, in late March, she died from an undetermined stomach ailment, which left the opportunity wide open for Mary Ann to console the grieving Frederick. In an echo of her relationship with James Robinson, she was soon pregnant with Frederick's child. In September of 1870, Mary Ann again signed the register as Mary Ann Mowbray, ignoring the fact that her surname was legally Robinson and that she was not divorced from James, who was very much alive. Mary Ann added bigamy to her growing list of crimes. She quickly set up housekeeping in Cotton's house and just as quickly ensured the lives of Frederick Cotton and his two sons. After giving birth to a son, Robert, in early 1871, Mary Ann learned that her former paramour, James Nattrass, was not married and lived in nearby West Auckland. Under some pretense, Mary Ann moved the family there, and she quickly rekindled the relationship with Nattrass and became less interested in Frederick Cotton. In December of 1871, Frederick died of gastric fever, and Joseph Nattrass soon became a lodger in the three-time widow Mary Ann's house. To keep her fears at bay and to keep money coming in, Mary Ann worked as a nurse to John Quick Manning, an excise officer recovering from smallpox. Mary Ann apparently saw Quick Manning as a better match than Nattrass and soon became pregnant by him. A marriage to Quick Manning was hindered by the presence of the remaining Cotton household, so Mary Ann apparently went to work quickly, and Frederick Jr. died in March of 1872, and the infant Robert soon after. Upon the death of her infant, Mary Ann stated that she did not want to bury the baby immediately because Joseph Nattrass had also become ill with gastric fever, and she would wait and handle both burials at once. Nattrass obligingly passed away soon after Robert, but not before revising his will to leave everything to Mary Ann. Only one of her husbands, James Robinson, had escaped a relationship with Mary Ann with his life. Other husbands, children, and most stepchildren had succumbed to gastric fever or stomach ailments, except for young Charles Cotton and Robinson's children. The Robinson children were safely away from Mary Ann's motherly care, but the insurance policy Mary Ann had taken out on Charles's life still waited to be collected. In late spring of 1872, Mary Ann sent Charles to a local chemist to purchase a small quantity of arsenic. The chemist refused to sell the poison to anyone under the age of 21, as was the law. Undeterred, Mary Ann asked a neighbor to purchase the substance, and in July, Charles died of gastric fever. But Mary Ann had either been in the West Auckland area too long, or the neighbors were more readily skeptical, because suspicions were immediately aroused in neighbors and physicians. The first person Mary Ann told about Charles's death was Thomas Riley, a minor government official that she had consulted previously about the possibility of sending Charles into a workhouse. Riley had said that it would only be possible if she went with him, which she declined. She told Riley that the boy was in the way of a marriage with Quick Manning and predicted that, "I won't be troubled long. He'll go like all the rest of the Cotton family." Riley said the boy appeared completely healthy, so he was surprised when Mary Ann stopped him only 5 days later to say that young Charles had died. Riley went to the village police officers and a doctor and outlined his growing suspicions. The doctor was similarly surprised to hear of the news, as he and his assistant had tended to Charles 5 times during the previous week and had detected nothing dire, let alone life-threatening, in the young boy. Riley convinced the doctor to delay writing a death certificate until he could look into the situation further. Instead of fetching the doctor after the boy's death, Mary Ann hurried to the insurance office to collect on Charles's policy. She learned that they would not issue the money until they had a death certificate, so she returned home to get the document from the doctor. Instead of receiving the certificate, Mary Ann received the startling news that she would not be receiving a signed death certificate until after a formal inquest was held. A brief inquest was held, and initial evidence did not indicate death by unnatural causes. Angry at Riley for initiating the investigation, Mary Ann told him that he could be responsible for Charles's burial costs. The young boy's internment would most likely not have been the end of the story, and Mary Ann would have gone on with her plan to marry Quick Manning and probably continue obtaining insurance monies from other gastric fever victims. But the local newspapers latched on to the story. They reported on the inquest and alluded to the neighborhood gossip that Mary Ann was an active poisoner. These reports fanned the fires of rumors and hearsay, and the feeling toward Mary Ann within West Auckland became bitter and suspicious. Quick Manning was appalled by this type of gossip about his intended and was apparently distressed enough to sever all connections with Mary Ann. Mary Ann began preparations to leave the area, although her friends warned her that it would look suspicious if she did. Unknown to her, however, suspicions were already building and were about to close in around her. A doctor from the inquiry had kept samples of Charles's stomach to test them later in his lab. He did so, and the samples tested positive for arsenic. The doctor went to the authorities, arrested Marianne, and ordered Charles's body to be exhumed and thoroughly tested. The body of Joseph Nattrass was also dug up. After 6 exhumations of other corpses, the elderly sexton of the church couldn't remember precisely where Nattrass was buried, and tested positive for the presence of arsenic. There were debate and talk of further exhumations, but it was decided to proceed with the single murder charge of young Charles Cotton, although the trial was delayed until the delivery of the daughter, fathered by John Quick Manning. Her trial began in March of 1873. The prosecution brought forth numerous witnesses who testified about Marianne's purchases of arsenic, the long list of gastric fever victims in her past, and about her statements regarding Charles being an obstacle to her marrying Quick Manning. The defense claimed that Charles might have obtained the arsenic that killed him from inhaling loose airborne particles of arsenic used as a dye in the Cotton home's green wallpaper. The judge dismissed this theory, and the jury retired for only 90 minutes before finding Marianne guilty of the murder of Charles Cotton. Marianne continued to proclaim her innocence and wrote numerous letters to her friends and supporters. A letter to her estranged husband, James Robinson, asked him to bring her child and 2 stepchildren to visit her in prison. She went on to beg Robinson, "If you have one spark of kindness in you, get my life spared. You know yourself there has been most dreadful lies told about me. I must tell you, you are the cause of all my trouble. If you had not abandoned me, I was left to wander the streets with my baby in my arms, no place to lay my head." Robinson ignored her letter, so she wrote him again and asked him to visit her. Robinson sent his brother-in-law to the prison in his stead. Marianne was upset that Robinson did not come himself, but asked the man about the children and requested that a petition be circulated in her support. Petitions were eventually created and signed by Marianne's former employers, ministers, and other supporters. As her execution date neared, she was cheered by a letter from a couple who had adopted the infant she and Quick Manning had conceived. She replied to the letter asking the couple to "kiss my babe for me." On March 24, 1873, Marianne was led to the scaffold where the elderly hangman misjudged the logistics of the execution. So instead of dying quickly, Marianne struggled after the trapdoor was released, and it took at least 3 minutes for her to be slowly and painfully strangled by the noose. Chances are some of Marianne's alleged victims died from natural causes or reasons other than poisoning by her hands. Later researchers of the case would estimate her victims as numbering anywhere from 15 to the full count of 21 people who died while living with or near Marianne. 10 of her children by various husbands, 3 of those husbands, 5 stepchildren, her mother, Cotton's sister Margaret, and her lover Nattrass. Theories of motive range from the collection of insurance money to the desire to rid herself of people that she felt were obstacles, or a combination of both. Because she maintained her innocence to the end, it will never be known for sure how many victims Marianne claimed in her endless quest for the money that made her feel secure. Her notoriety continues with her fame as Britain's first female serial killer and in a popular children's rhyme. Marianne Cotton, she's dead and she's rotten. She lies in her bed with her eyes wide open. Sing, sing, oh, what can I sing? Marianne Cotton is tied up with string. Where? Up in the air. Selling black puddings, a penny a pair.
Hetty McClellan took her blonde, blue-eyed baby daughter Chelsea to the new pediatric clinic. It was Friday, September 17th, 1982. The clinic had just opened the day before in Kerrville, Texas, not far from the trailer home where she and her husband Reed lived. Chelsea was just 8 months old, but she had a cold and her mother wanted to be safe. Chelsea had been born premature, with underdeveloped lungs, so she was prone to infection. Early in her life, she had spent time on a hospital respirator. She had also experienced what Petty described as spells of losing her breath. Chelsea was the clinic's very first patient. In Women Who Kill, Carol Ann Davis, who bases much of her account on deadly medicine, wrote that pediatric nurse Genene Jones took the child to another area of the clinic to play with a ball while Dr. Kathleen Holland talked with the mother. Soon after, Jones told them that Chelsea had stopped breathing. She placed an oxygen mask over the baby's face, and they rushed her to an emergency room at nearby Peterson Hospital. To everyone's relief, the child recovered. Chelsea's parents were grateful that such a competent nurse was on staff there. They spread the word to other parents. 9 months later, they brought Chelsea in again. This time, the results were drastically different. Peter Elkind, a journalist who briefly met Genene Jones, offers a fuller account in The Death Shift. Chelsea was the first appointment of the day, just a routine checkup. Petty McClellan brought her in around mid-morning, and Dr. Holland ordered 2 standard inoculations. Shortly after the nurse, Genene Jones, injected the first needle, Chelsea started having trouble breathing. It appeared that she was having a seizure, so McClellan asked her to stop. Jones ignored her and gave the child a second injection. Then Chelsea stopped breathing altogether. She jerked around as if trying to breathe and then went limp. An ambulance was called, and they transported Chelsea to Sid Peterson Hospital, where she arrived in 9 minutes with a breathing tube down her throat. Jones carried the child in her arms all the way there. Chelsea tried to remove the tube, so Dr. Holland replaced it with a larger one and then gave her something to make her sleep. Jones allegedly said, "And they said there wouldn't be any excitement when we came to Kerrville." In fact, there was to be plenty of excitement at that clinic, more than most clinics get, and Jones was always at the center. Holland arranged to transport Chelsea to a hospital where neurological tests could be performed, and while she was in the ambulance, Chelsea stopped breathing again and her heart stopped. Jones gave her several injections while Dr. Holland performed a heart massage, but there was no response. They pulled into a nearby hospital and continued treatment, but after 20 minutes, it was clear that they had failed. Chelsea McClellan was dead. Jones sobbed over the body as she cleaned it up and wrapped it in a blanket for the McClellans. Petty McClellan believed that her daughter was merely asleep. No matter what anyone said to her, she could not come to terms with the fact that Chelsea was dead. They all returned to Sid Peterson Hospital, and Jones carried the child downstairs to the hospital morgue. Dr. Holland wanted an autopsy. She was not going to just let this go as a cardiac arrest. The whole thing had been too unusual. Chelsea had not even come in with a complaint. She had been there for a routine examination. The autopsy was performed, and Holland waited for the results. In the meantime, the McClellans arranged the funeral. After a few weeks, it was determined that Chelsea had died of SIDS, an often fatal breathing dysfunction in babies. But new tests would later challenge that conclusion. Petty McClellan was unable to cope, according to Elkind. At the funeral, she screamed and fainted, and her relatives sent her to get psychiatric help. Thanks to that, she had spent a considerable amount of time in a haze, but the sharp grief had not yet dulled. One day, a week after the funeral, she went to the Garden of Memories cemetery to lay flowers on her daughter's grave. As she approached the grave, she saw the nurse from the clinic, Genene Jones. Oddly, she was kneeling at the foot of Chelsea's grave, sobbing and wailing the child's name over and over. She rocked back and forth, apparently in deep anguish, as if Chelsea had been her own daughter. "What are you doing here?" McClellan asked. Did this nurse feel guilty about her role in Chelsea's death? Perhaps she had neglected to do something that had made the crucial difference. Confronted, Jones returned a blank stare as if in a trance and walked away without a word. When she was gone, McClellan noticed something else. While Jones had left a small token of flowers, she had taken a bow from Chelsea's grave. In the Encyclopedia of Serial Killers, Michael Newton describes Jones's background. She had been a beautician before going into nursing in 1977 and had worked at several hospitals in the San Antonio area. Peter Elkind says that she had claimed to have grown up feeling unwanted and unloved. Genene was born on July 13, 1950, and was immediately given up for adoption. Her new parents were Dick and Gladys Jones, who adopted 3 other children as well, 2 older and 1 younger than Genene. They lived in a 2-story, 4-bedroom mansion just outside San Antonio. Dick was an entrepreneur and professional gambler. He worked in the entertainment business, operating nightclubs. Somewhat larger than life, he was free-spending and generous, but his lifestyle eventually took a toll on his family. The nightclub went south, and there was less money to spend. Jones tried a restaurant, but that venture failed too. When Genene was 10, her father was arrested. It seemed that a large safe had turned up missing from a home owned by a man who had been at Jones's club at the time of the burglary. There was $1,500 in cash and some valuable jewelry inside. A priest turned it over to the police, protecting the one who had given it to him, but the police went after Dick Jones. He confessed but claimed the episode was a practical joke. The charges were dropped. Then Jones opened a billboard business. For Genene, according to Carol Ann Davis in Women Who Kill, riding around in the truck with her father while he put up billboards was the happiest time of her life. Other than that, she had a hard time getting attention. She felt left out and unfavored by her parents. She went around calling herself the family's black sheep. Sometimes she would pretend to be ill in order to get people to notice, and at school she became bossy. She was short and overweight, which added to her loneliness. There were acquaintances who called her aggressive and friends who said she had betrayed them. She was known for lying and manipulating people. Genene was close to her younger brother, Travis, who loved to be in their father's shop. When he was 14, he put together a pipe bomb that blew up in his face, killing him. Genene was 16 at the time, and during the funeral, she screamed and fainted. She had lost her closest companion. Some believe this trauma fed her peculiar cruelty. Others said she was just histrionic and grabbed any opportunity for attention. During her senior year of high school, Genene's father began to get sick. He was diagnosed with terminal cancer, refused treatment, and went home to die. He made it through Christmas 1967, but died shortly afterward at the age of 56, just over a year after the death of Travis. Genene was devastated, and though she hadn't yet finished high school, believed that the remedy to her pain and loss was to get married right away. She and her mother fought over it, and Gladys soon turned to the bottle, getting drunk frequently but refusing to give permission for Genene to marry. It was too soon after the family tragedies. Finally, when Genene graduated, she married a high school dropout, James Jimmy Harvey Delaney Jr. Davis claims that she trapped this man into marrying her by pretending she was pregnant. He too was overweight, and he cared only about hot rods. After 7 months of marriage, he enlisted in the Navy, and Genene, who was reportedly voracious in her desire for sex, was immediately unfaithful. Intense and dramatic, she went after other men as if to fill the void left by her father's untimely death, and she bragged openly about it. She even had affairs with married men, and she began to spread rumors that she had been sexually abused as a child. She depended on her mother for money, so Gladys urged her to think about a career. With no real plans, Genene enrolled in beauty school. Jimmy returned from the Navy, and they had a child. After 4 years of marriage, she left her husband while he was recovering in the hospital from a boating accident. Her divorce papers indicated that he had been violent with her. They reconciled and then parted again for good. Soon after, Genene's older brother died of cancer. It was yet another loss, and her developing fear of cancer from working with hair dyes made a career change necessary. She'd worked in a hospital beauty salon, so it wasn't a far stretch to train as a nurse. She was also pregnant, so now she had 2 children to care for. Although she'd wanted children all her life, she ended up leaving them in the care of her adoptive mother. Genene had reserved her special ardor for doctors, seeing them as mysterious and powerful. She wanted to get near them, so she trained for a year to become a vocational nurse and LVN, or licensed vocational nurse. She was good at it, although she was not altogether happy about being at the bottom of the medical totem pole. Her interest in medicine began to take on mystical dimensions, and, as acquaintances put it, she became obsessed with diagnosing people. After only 8 months at her first job at San Antonio's Methodist Hospital, she was fired, in part because she tried to make decisions in areas where she had no authority, and in part because she made rude demands on a patient who subsequently complained. It wasn't difficult for her to find another job, but she didn't last long in that one either. Eventually, she was hired in the intensive care section of the pediatric unit of Bexar County Medical Center Hospital. It was here that she would leave her mark, a tragic one. The first child she picked up had a fatal intestinal condition, and when he died shortly after surgery, she went berserk. She brought a stool into her cubicle where the body lay and sat staring at it. The other nurses could not understand her behavior. She hadn't even known the child and had barely been around him, so why the excessive grief? It soon became clear to associates that Genene liked to feel needed, and she would often spend long hours on the ward during her 3 to 11 p.m. shift, insisting that her attention was important to a certain patient. However, she skipped classes on the proper handling of drugs, and in her first year, made 8 separate nursing errors, including while dispensing medication. She sometimes developed a dependency on sick children, so she would refuse specific orders because she wanted to do what was best for the child. While there were sufficient grounds for dismissal, including coming in one night drunk, the head nurse, Pat Belko, liked and protected her, which gave Jones a feeling of invincibility. She never liked to admit any mistakes, and now she had someone in power to back her up. She tried to bully new nurses into looking to her for help, and more than one nurse transferred out of the unit to get away from her. As she took charge, Genene grew more arrogant, aggressive, and foul-mouthed. She liked to talk about her sexual conquests, both past and future. Not many people liked her. She would make harrowing predictions about which baby was going to die, which upset the new nurses she was training. Then a new doctor came to the ward, James Robotham. Hired as the medical director of the pediatric intensive care unit, he took more responsibility for patients than other doctors had, and that meant edging out the nurses. He also made them more accountable, which didn't sit well with them. All except for Genene, who welcomed the opportunity to bring more problems to someone's attention because that meant attention for her. Her other means of getting noticed was to go to outpatient clinics for minor physical complaints of her own, which Elkind says she did 30 times in just over 2 years. Although she was never officially diagnosed, she may have been suffering from a form of Munchausen syndrome, in which people become hospital hobos to get attention from caring staff that they feel they missed out on as children. Even when Genene wasn't at some county clinic, she was complaining about her health and seeking some leverage with it. One physician said her problems were psychosomatic. In 1981, Jones demanded to be put in charge of the sickest patients. That placed her close to those who died. She seemed to thrive on the excitement of an emergency and even on grief when a child didn't make it. When she prepared a body, she would sing to it, and she always wanted to take the corpse to the morgue. This routine was a regular procession, with the security guard walking ahead of her to close patients' doors. Genene often cried as she performed this task, but then again, it did seem as if she liked to cry. No one seemed concerned that many medications were freely available on that ward in an unlocked cabinet. Not until later. Nor did they give any thought to the fact that the hospital where Genene had last worked had not given a reason for her dismissal. No one followed up, although Genene was placed in a role of significant responsibility. Her special talent, Elkind points out, was putting intravenous tubes into veins. She requested special seminars handling certain drugs and asked many questions. People were impressed by how much she wanted to learn. It eventually became clear to everyone that children were dying in this unit from problems that shouldn't have been fatal. Davis claims there was one 2-week period where 7 children died. The need for resuscitation suddenly seemed constant, but only when Genene was around. Those in the most critical condition were all under her care. There was no denying the excitement that an emergency situation engendered, and Genene even commented on several occasions that it was an incredible experience. One child had a seizure 3 days in a row, but only on her shift. "They're going to start thinking I'm the death nurse," Jones quipped one day. In fact, some of the staff called her on-duty hours the death shift, based on the many resuscitations that were going on during the hours she was there, and the many deaths. She even seemed to enjoy calling parents to let them know about their child's death and to commiserate. If a baby's health was bad, she would announce to the other nurses, "Tonight is the night." If a child was near death, she always took a special interest. She clearly wanted to be there when it happened. While rumors were passed around that Genene was doing something to these children, Pat Belko defended her. It was just gossip from nurses who were jealous of her competence. She refused to listen. Then a baby named Jose Antonio Flores, 6 months old, came in with some common childhood symptoms: fever, vomiting, and diarrhea. While in Genene's care, he developed unexplained seizures and went into cardiac arrest. It took doctors almost an hour to save young Jose, but they did. They noticed he was bleeding badly, and they could not determine the cause. They found that his blood was not clotting, but eventually the problem subsided and he seemed okay, until the following day during the 3 to 11 shift. Once again, Jose went into seizures and began to bleed. Early the next morning, his heart stopped beating. Cause of death? Unknown. When a doctor told Jose's father about losing his son, the man had a heart attack. While helping Mr. Flores to the emergency room, Genene allowed Jose's older brother to carry the baby's body. Then she grabbed the dead baby and ran down the hospital corridor. Several members of the family ran after her. She lost them and went into the morgue. No one could figure out what her behavior meant, but blood testing on the body indicated an overdose of a drug called heparin, an anticoagulant. No one had ordered it, and her superiors became suspicious. Then 2 resident physicians who were treating a 3-month-old boy named Albert Garza found that Genene had probably given him an overdose of heparin. When they confronted her, she got angry and left, but the child recovered. This incident also resulted in tighter control over the staff's use of heparin, making nurses more accountable and records more precise. Children whose health declined were to be subjected to extra lab tests. If someone was doing something to children on this ward, she was going to get caught. It was at this point that Genene's health seemed to be suffering. She also refused drugs prescribed by doctors to improve her condition. Often when she complained of something, there was no evidence for it. Again, it appeared she was angling for attention. Dr. Robotham, who had once been her ally, began to complain formally about Genene Jones. In November 1981, the hospital administration, somewhat resistant to an internal investigation of the pediatrics ward, had a meeting. They decided that Dr. Robotham was overreacting. The struggling hospital did not need the possibility that such suspicions would come to the public's attention, so they declined to follow through. Yet that did not end Robotham's efforts to launch a formal investigation. He continued to watch the records of the 3 to 11 shift. While heparin use was carefully monitored, another drug suddenly showed up in the death of Joshua Sawyer, age 11 months. He was brought in suffering from the effects of smoke inhalation after a fire at his home. He'd had a cardiac arrest, and doctors ordered Dilantin. He remained in a coma, but doctors expected him to make progress. Genene told his parents that he'd be better off if allowed to die, however, since he would surely have serious brain damage. Then, quite suddenly, Joshua had 2 heart attacks and died. His lab test showed a toxic amount of Dilantin in his blood. Clearly, someone's handling at the hospital had killed him, but the test results went unnoticed. When Genene became aware that those who had always supported her were now suspicious, she turned to blackmail. She said she had records on every child that had died there, and she knew which doctor had killed them. Robotham requested that she be fired, but no one listened. They also did not listen to the nurse who kept reporting that supplies were missing. Then Rolando Santos, a 1-month-old baby being treated for pneumonia, was suddenly having seizures, cardiac arrest, and extensive unexplained bleeding. All of his troubles developed or intensified on Genene's shift. He began to urinate so badly that he suffered extreme dehydration. For the 3 days Genene had off, the baby improved, but the afternoon she returned, he began to hemorrhage. Then he had a heart attack. Lab tests showed an excessive amount of heparin. Initially, a doctor took over his care, but after Genene got hold of him, he worsened again and went into a coma. Blood came up into his throat, and his blood pressure dropped dangerously. A doctor saved him and then ordered him removed from the pediatric ICU and placed under 24-hour surveillance. Only under these conditions did he improve enough to be released to his parents. Rolando survived his encounter with Genene Jones. He was one of the lucky ones. Finally, one more doctor stepped forward to tell the hospital administration that Genene Jones, the afternoon shift nurse, was killing children. He had found a manual in her possessions about how to inject heparin subcutaneously without leaving a mark, and he had evidence of how Rolando Santos had suffered during Genene Jones's working hours. The hospital resisted, however, not wanting bad press. Another child was sent to the pediatrics unit to recover from open-heart surgery. At first, he progressed well, but on Genene's shift, he became lethargic. Then his condition deteriorated, and he died. The doctors were puzzled and could only attribute his death to some infection. In view of everyone in the room where the child had succumbed, Genene grabbed a syringe and squirted fluid over his forehead in the sign of a cross, then repeated it on herself. She grabbed the dead baby and began to cry. More doctors complained, and finally a committee was formed to look into the problem. Pat Belko and James Robotham were in charge. An outside team of investigators came in and determined that there was clearly a problem, but they declined to pin it on a single nurse. In the end, the committee decided to replace the LVNs on the unit with RNs, which meant that Genene would be transferred away from the babies. She reacted to this change by resigning. The administrators were relieved. In their minds, that took care of the problem. All it did, however, was transfer the problem. The medical emergencies on the afternoon shift returned to manageable numbers, but they started up elsewhere. In 1982, Dr. Kathleen Holland opened a pediatrics clinic in Kerrville, Texas. Needing help, she hired Genene Jones. She had worked at Bexar County Hospital with her and had even testified on her behalf during the investigation. Although Dr. Holland was warned in veiled tones not to hire Genene, she went ahead and did it, viewing Genene as a victim of the male-dominated medical patriarchy. She believed that Genene was a competent nurse who just needed a chance, and she gave her the title of pediatric clinician. According to Carol Ann Davis, Holland helped to move Genene to Kerrville and rented rooms to her and her 2 children. Just months after Genene left Bexar, someone found a novel with her name in it called The Sisterhood, written by best-selling ER physician Michael Palmer. The plot centered on a group of medical professionals who were pledged to end human suffering by terminating patients who they believed would be better off dead. They had a specific protocol in place to ensure the most careful scrutiny. But as always in fiction, someone took things too far. In Murder Most Rare, Michael D. Kelleher and C.L. Kelleher reserve a chapter for lethal caretakers, medical professionals who kill their patients. This contemporary form of the angel of death, they say, embodies an especially pernicious darkness in our humanity by systematically attacking the weak and defenseless who've been involuntarily placed into her care or must rely on her for comfort and support. These people carry out their crimes within institutions where chemicals and syringes are abundant and where they can hide their behavior for long periods of time. Typically, they select patients whose deaths are explainable because they were in some weakened or near-fatal condition already. Easy to kill, easy to cover up. Yet what motivates these people? Ego and a compulsion for domination, says the authors. She's obsessed with the need to control those who are completely dependent on her. Some, like Genene Jones, are also motivated by a need for attention. While they appear to be going about their routines, they're making decisions about who should live and who should die. What happens to the patient does not matter to the caretakers. What matters is what the incident does for them. Many patients around Kerrville were happy to have Dr. Holland's clinic available. But during a period of 2 months that first summer, 7 different children succumbed to seizures while in her office. In one case, Genene told a worried mother that her child was just having a tantrum, an understatement that nearly cost the child her life. Holland transferred each of them by ambulance to Kerr County's Sid Peterson Hospital, never thinking the seizures were suspicious. Yet Genene's account of these incidents always differed from those of other professionals involved. And one of them had seen her inject something into a child who then had seizures. From the sheer number of children affected in the same clinic, the hospital staff thought something odd must be going on, especially since the kids always recovered quickly while in the hospital. Holland assumed the severity of the situation was because she was a specialist, not a generalist, so the worst cases were brought to her. At least they all had recovered. But then Chelsea McClellan died while en route from the hospital to another facility. Dr. Holland was devastated, as were Chelsea's parents. The child had not even been very ill. The same day, after Genene had returned to the clinic to see another patient, the boy went into seizures and had to be resuscitated. The child stabilized, and his parents later commented that Genene had appeared to be quite excited over the incident, even happy. Tests afterward indicated there was no reason for such an unexpected episode. At about that time, a doctor at Sid Peterson discovered the high number of baby deaths at the hospital where Genene Jones had previously worked. He brought this to the attention of a committee, and they began to realize that she was doing something to these children. They brought in Dr. Holland and asked if she was using succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant. She said she had some in her office but did not use it. Without telling her, someone on the committee notified the Texas Rangers. Holland told Genene about the meeting, and Genene assured Dr. Holland that she had found the bottle of succinylcholine that was missing. The cap was gone, and Holland began to have suspicions. On September 27th, while Genene was at lunch, Dr. Holland examined the bottles of succinylcholine. They were both nearly full, but one of them had pinprick holes through the rubber stopper. When Genene could not give a credible accounting of it, and even suggested they just throw the bottle away to avoid questions, Dr. Holland was alarmed. She later learned that the near-full bottle had been filled with saline. In other words, someone had been using a lot of this dangerous drug, which paralyzed people into a sort of hell on earth. They lay inert but aware and unable to get anyone's attention. Before she could take any action, Dr. Holland was faced with another crisis. Genene told her that she'd taken an overdose of doxepin, a drug to fight anxiety. She had to have her stomach pumped, but it turned out she had not overdosed at all. She had taken only 4 of the pills, but she had faked a semi-coma, forcing emergency personnel to treat her. Then Holland discovered that another bottle of succinylcholine had been ordered but was missing. On September 28th, she fired Genene and offered any help she could to the investigation. Even so, families left her practice, and Sid Peterson suspended her privileges. By hiring Genene Jones, Holland was losing everything. Even her husband divorced her. On top of that, she saw evidence that Genene was trying to frame her, and she began to fear for her own life. On October 12, 1982, a grand jury in Kerr County organized hearings on the 8 children from Holland's clinic who had developed emergency respiratory problems, and the one who had died, Chelsea McClellan. Her body was exhumed to examine the tissues with an expensive test that had just been developed in Sweden to detect the presence of succinylcholine. The test showed that her death appeared to have been caused by an injection of the muscle relaxant. However, it was exceedingly difficult to get real proof against the nurse. No one had seen her give the actual injection. In February 1983, another grand jury was convened in San Antonio to look into a stunning total of 47 suspicious deaths of children at Bexar County Medical Center Hospital. All had occurred over a period of 4 years, and all coincided with Genene Jones's tenure at that facility. There was plenty of testimony from coworkers about Genene's behavior, but again, no real proof. 3 former Bexar employees, including Jones, then 32, were questioned by both grand juries. Dr. Holland was also questioned, and Chelsea's parents named her and Jones in a wrongful death suit. Holland had turned against Genene, offering the district attorney ammunition against her former nurse, specifically in her discovery of the bottles of succinylcholine. At some point, Genene married a 19-year-old boy, possibly to deflect tabloid rumors that she was a lesbian. She was caught trying to flee with them. The Kerr County grand jury concluded first and indicted Jones on 1 count of murder in Kerr County and several charges of injury to 7 other children who had been injected with muscle-relaxing drugs. For these, she faced a possible sentence of 99 years, and she was held in Kerr County Jail in lieu of a $225,000 bond. Then, in November, the San Antonio grand jury indicted her for injuring 4-week-old boy Rolando Santos with a deliberate injection of heparin almost 2 years earlier. He had nearly died from it. Jones remained a suspect in 10 other infant deaths at the hospital. Administrators at the facilities where she had worked were appalled. They were also embarrassed because it became increasingly clear that they had known something and had not acted. While awaiting trial, Jones supposedly told someone, according to Elkind, "I always cry when babies die." You can almost explain away an adult death. While you look at an adult dying, you can say they've had a full life. When a baby dies, they've been cheated. She claimed she was receiving death threats, although the notes she showed people bore the same handwriting and misspellings as those she herself had sent to a nurse once in San Antonio. When her trial was moved to a new venue in Georgetown, Texas, her attorney asked to be replaced. She gave interviews freely to reporters that undermined his attempts to build a defense, and he feared that she would do the same on the witness stand. There were 2 separate trials, and the first one began on January 15, 1984, for the murder of Chelsea McClellan and injury to other children. Prosecutors said Genene Jones had a hero complex. She needed to take the children to the edge of death and then bring them back so she could be acclaimed their savior. One of her former colleagues reported that she had wanted to get more sick children into the intensive care unit. "They're out there," she supposedly said. "All you have to do is find them." Witnesses testified that she would contradict herself by telling one person she had injected a specific type of substance and another person that it was something else. All in all, her pattern of behavior was clearly suspicious, including the fact that she had asked for an educational seminar specifically on the use of succinylcholine. Yet her actions may actually have been inspired by a more mundane motive. She liked the excitement and the attention it brought her. There was no doubt that her behavior had escalated and that she had taken more risks. The children couldn't tell on her. They were at her mercy. She was free to create emergencies over and over. It was Munchausen syndrome by proxy, getting attention from doctors by making someone else sick. No one raised the possibility that Genene had acted out something that had been done to her as a child. While she had hinted at abuse to friends, there was no one to confirm that. Much of this was replayed at the second trial, but specifically in regard to her behavior at Bayer. In a statistical report presented at that trial, an investigator stated that children were 25% more likely to have a cardiac arrest when Jones was in charge, and 10% more likely to die. A psychiatric exam failed to provide her with the testimony she would need for an insanity defense. Instead, her lawyer brought in witnesses to testify that Genene was devoted, competent, and responsible. The first jury deliberated for only 3 hours. On February 15, 1984, Jones was convicted of murder, and she was given the maximum sentence of 99 years. Later that year, in October, she was found guilty on the charge of injuring Rolando Santos by injection. The 2 sentences totaled 159 years, but with the possibility of parole. Although she was suspected in the deaths of other children, the staff at the Bexar County Medical Center Hospital shredded 9,000 pounds of pharmaceutical records, thus destroying potential evidence that was under the grand jury subpoena. Most of those at Bayer who had protected her ended up resigning, and the clinic settled the legal suit brought by the McClellans. Jones came up for parole after 10 years, but relatives of Chelsea McClellan successfully fought to keep her behind bars, where she'll remain at least until 2009, when she's again eligible for parole.
The stench hovered over the Sacramento neighborhood like a putrid fog, sickly sweet and pungent. Everyone knew where it came from. The yard of the pale blue Victorian at 1426 F Street, where Dorothea Puente rented out rooms to elderly and infirm boarders. During the summer, it got so bad that some neighbors preferred to turn off their air conditioners and suffer the blazing Delta heat rather than have the fans suck the stench into their homes. The sewers backed up, the 59-year-old boarding house mistress told people when they complained. Other times she blamed rats rotting under the floorboards, or the fish emulsion she'd used to fertilize the garden. She tried to blot out the feeder by dumping bags of lime and gallons of bleach into the yard and spraying her parlor with lemon-scented air freshener when guests dropped in. But no matter what she tried, the stench refused to fade. It clung to the boarding house like a curse. When her boarders started disappearing, a concerned social worker tipped off the police, who made a gruesome discovery: 7 bodies buried in the garden. Not long afterward, Puente appeared in court, accused of murdering her tenants so she could steal their government benefit checks and buy herself luxuries, ranging from fancy clothes to a facelift. This is a story of keeping up appearances. Dorothea Puente tried hard to project a polished exterior with cosmetic surgery and tailored clothes. She also projected herself as an upstanding member of Sacramento society, a small-time socialite who gave to charity and rubbed elbows with second-tier politicians. No one suspected that the sweet-faced, grandmotherly Puente was systematically drugging and killing her frail boarders, and burying their remains in the yard she so lovingly tended. With her careful exterior, she got away with murder for years. The 2-story pale blue house stood on a quiet, tree-lined street of similar gingerbread Victorians. Although the neighborhood was once the ritzy section of the state capitol, the former governor's mansion is 2 blocks away, it had fallen into disrepair, and many of the once stately homes were boarded up or used as flophouses. On the morning of November 11, 1988, Detective John Cabrera and a couple of colleagues visited 1426 F Street looking for Alvaro Bert Montoya, a mentally retarded tenant whose social worker had reported him missing. As they approached the high black iron fence surrounding the house, they noted it was strung with Christmas tree lights and that lace curtains hung in the windows. The men knocked on the front door and asked Puente if they could have a look around. "Go ahead," she said. The interior of the house was cluttered with old lady knickknacks, miniature vases and porcelain dolls and doilies. But they didn't immediately notice anything out of the ordinary. They did in the backyard, however. At the southeast corner of the property, the ground had been recently disturbed. The men returned to their cars to retrieve the shovels and spades they'd brought on a hunch. They began digging and quickly turned up what looked like shreds of cloth and beef jerky. When their efforts were hampered by what appeared to be a tree root, Cabrera whacked and jabbed it with his shovel. It didn't budge, so he decided to climb down into the hole and get his hands dirty. "I wrapped my hand around it, braced my feet, and started pulling," Cabrera later told the Sacramento Bee. "I pulled so hard that it broke loose, and when I pulled it up, I could see the joint. It was a bone. At that time, I was airborne and out of the hole." Hearing the commotion, Puente walked into the corner of the yard and peered down into the hole herself. When Cabrera told her that they'd found what appeared to be a human corpse, she acted shocked and slapped her palms to the sides of her face. The men stopped digging when they found a shoe with a piece of the foot still wedged in it and decided to return the next day with the proper equipment. The next morning, a Saturday, a team of forensic anthropologists, officials from the coroner's office, and a county work crew equipped with heavy machinery descended on the property. The first person they dug from the yard was the body the officers had stumbled across the day before, a small female with gray hair that had rotted into a skeleton. A crowd of onlookers and reporters watched the proceedings from the other side of the high fence. Boys shimmied up trees for a better view. The mood was party-like, until a fresh body was unburied and carried to the coroner's wagon, and the crowd grew solemn. As the team drilled through a slab of concrete and prepared to excavate beneath it, Puente walked into the yard and approached Cabrera, wearing a cherry-red overcoat, purple pumps, and carrying a pink umbrella. She asked the detective if she was under arrest. He said no. She asked if she could go to the Clarion Hotel, a few blocks away, to have a cup of coffee, and he said yes. escorting her past the reporters and curious onlookers before returning to the yard work. In rapid succession, the team found 3 bodies under the slab of cement and a 5th under a gazebo in the side yard. But by the time authorities noticed that the white-haired landlady hadn't returned from the hotel, 4 hours had passed and Dorothea Puente was hundreds of miles away. Ultimately, the grisly harvest of Puente's garden would be 7 people who had checked into her boarding house and never checked out alive. Alvaro Bert Montoya, 51, a retarded schizophrenic who argued in Spanish with the voices inside his head and called Puente Mama, found under a newly planted apricot tree in the side yard. Dorothy Miller, 64, an American Indian with a drinking problem who liked to recite poems about heartbreak, found with her arms taped to her chest with duct tape. The last time her social worker saw her, she was sitting on the front porch, enjoying a cigarette. Benjamin Fink, a 55-year-old alcoholic found dressed in striped boxer shorts. Shortly before he disappeared, in April 1988, Puente told another boarder that she was going to take Ben upstairs and make him feel better. Betty Palmer, 78, whose remains, missing the head, hands, and lower legs, were found in a sleeveless white nightgown below a statue of St. Francis de Assisi, a few feet from the sidewalk at the front of the house. Leona Carpenter, also 78, who was discharged from the hospital to Puente's care in February 1987, and had spent several weeks agonizing on a sofa before disappearing. She was buried near the back fence, and it was her leg bone that Detective Cabrera mistook for a tree root. James Gallup, a 62-year-old who survived a heart attack and brain tumor surgery, but not Dorothea Puente. And Vera Faye Martin, 64, whose wristwatch was still ticking when she was unearthed. The bodies were all severely decayed, and in several cases the internal organs had melded together into a leathery mass. Handling the rancid bodies and other items from the crime scene proved too much for police clerk Joy Underwood, who was sent to the morgue one night to help a technician label the evidence. She told Associated Press that afterward she vomited every time she saw a news report about the case and began to shower compulsively, feeling like she could never get clean. "I still have the taste of death in my mouth," she told reporters. "I can't eat vegetables grown in the ground because they have dirt around them like the people dug up in Puente's yard, and I'm a vegetarian." Puente indulged her champagne taste with her dead tenant's income. When she was arrested, her face was still unnaturally tight from a facelift, and in her room, detectives found $110 bottles of Giorgio perfume and silk chiffon dresses. Details of the case emerged slowly. Puente had been renting out the first story of the Victorian to old and alcoholic boarders and using the second story as her living quarters. A search of the boarding house had turned up a note on which Puente had scrawled the first initial of each victim and the amount she was getting from forging their disability and social security checks. Before her arrest, she was making $5,000 a month off her dead tenants. By all accounts, Puente ran a tight ship. Boarders paid $350 a month for a private room and 2 hot meals a day, breakfast at 6:30 a.m. and dinner at 3:30 p.m. Puente was an accomplished cook, preparing gut-busting breakfasts of pancakes, bacon, and eggs. But if residents missed either meal, they went hungry. They weren't allowed to enter the kitchen at odd hours. They also weren't allowed to touch the phone or the mail. Puente chewed residents out on more than one occasion for daring to touch the mail. And while Puente kept a well-stocked bar for herself upstairs, drinking by residents was strictly forbidden. In the evening, she made excursions to seedy liquor joints like Harry's Lounge, where she'd sidle up to solitary old men, ply them with drinks, and ask about their finances. If she thought enough of their income, she'd invite them to move into her boarding house. She asked me where I got my money from, where I was working. Harry's regular John Terry, 67, told the State Journal-Register. About every time she would see me, she'd hit me up about it, wanting me to move in. Terry refused, and lived to tell the tale. In interviews, people gave conflicting descriptions of Puente's personality. John Sharp, 64, a retired cook who lived in the boarding house for 11 months until the police shut the place down, told reporters that Puente had a gentle side. She fed stray cats, gave her boarders clothes and cigarettes, and even bought one disabled tenant an adult tricycle so he could be more mobile. The media feeding frenzy was enormous, with every news organization looking for a unique angle. When neighbors told reporters that Puente passed out tamales at Christmas time, the National Enquirer wanted to know if the meat in the tamales tasted funny. The LA Times tracked down Patty Casey, a 54-year-old cab driver who ferried Puente around town and eventually became a friend who visited Puente at the boarding house. Casey told the paper that she drove Puente on errands several times a week to buy cement, plants, or fertilizer, or dropped her off at various dive bars in downtown Sacramento. Puente confessed secrets to the cabbie, saying she was really 71 and not 59, as the records indicated, and telling her about her 4 failed marriages and her recent facelift. "I thought she was a nice person," Casey told the paper. "I really looked up to her and admired her. I felt I could learn a few things from her. I thought she was very savvy." When Casey commented on the unpleasant odor permeating the house, Puente told her it came from dead rats that were rotting under the floorboards. The police were also interviewing former boarders, and certain patterns that became evident. Several times before a tenant disappeared, for example, Puente would tell someone that so-and-so wasn't feeling well and that she was taking them upstairs to make them feel better. And she always had excuses for the disappearances. One tenant was becoming burdensome and telling her how to run her house, so she'd packed his stuff into cardboard boxes in the middle of the night and threw them on the street. Another left suddenly to live with relatives. Under the guise of the benevolent grandmother lurked a lifelong criminal. And diligent reporters carefully pieced Puente's life story together and published it. She was born Dorothea Helen Gray on January 9, 1929, in Redlands, California. And although she claimed to be the youngest of 18 children, her birth certificate showed she was her mother's 6th child. Hers was a childhood marred by tragedy, with her father dying of tuberculosis when she was 8, and her mother dying in a motorcycle accident a year later. The Gray children were farmed out to different homes, and according to census records, she lived in the city of Napa at age 13. School records show she was a student in Los Angeles at 16, but less than a year later, she moved to Olympia, Washington, where she called herself Sherry, and worked in a milkshake parlor during the summer of 1945. She met Fred McFall, a 22-year-old soldier back from the war in the Philippines that fall. She and a friend were living in a motel room and turning tricks there as prostitutes. She was a good-looking female, McFall told reporters. She knew how to make a buck when she wanted to. When the couple was married in Reno a few months later, the 16-year-old Puente said she was 30 and called herself Sherry Ale Resil, information duly recorded on the marriage certificate. McFall soon found out that Puente was an inveterate liar. Not only did she love to adorn her body with expensive clothes, silk stockings, and flirty dresses, she also loved to embellish her background. When she was young, she lied to make herself seem more interesting, and it was a habit that stuck for life. Sources close to her said she claimed to have lived through the Bataan Death March in World War II, when she was 13, and the bombing of Hiroshima. She was the sister of the ambassador to Sweden, she told people, and a close friend of Rita Hayworth. McFall and Puente set up house in Gardnerville, Nevada, and had 2 daughters. Shortly after the birth of their second daughter, Puente went to Los Angeles. She became pregnant several months later. She miscarried the baby, but McFall left her anyway, and the couple's daughters were raised by other people, one by McFall's mother, and the other adopted by strangers. The easy money she got from hooking was a hard habit for Puente to shake. In 1948, she stole checks from an acquaintance to buy a hat, purse, shoes, and pantyhose. She was convicted of forgery, served 4 years in jail, then skipped town when she was on probation. In 1952, she married her second husband, Axel Johansson. Johansson was a merchant seaman, and when he returned from long absences, he'd sometimes find other men living with his wife. Neighbors complained of taxis dropping off strange men at all hours of the night. The couple fought, separated, made up, separated, and remained married for 14 more years. In 1960, she was convicted of residing in a Sacramento brothel. She told authorities she was just visiting a friend and didn't know it was a whorehouse, according to reports. In 1968, Puente, 39, opened a halfway house for alcoholics called the Samaritans and married 21-year-old Robert Jose Puente. The couple argued constantly, and the marriage ended a year later, as did the halfway house when she ran up a $10,000 debt. Soon afterward, she moved in and began managing the boarding house located at 21st and F Streets in Sacramento. And in 1976, she married one of the tenants, Pedro Angel Montalvo, 52. She wanted new pantyhose every day, Montalvo told the press. She thought she was rich. In 1978, she was convicted of forging 34 checks she'd stolen from her tenants. She served 5 years on probation and was ordered to undergo counseling. A psychiatrist who interviewed her diagnosed her as a schizophrenic and a very disturbed woman. Authorities allege that Puente committed her first murder in the spring of 1982, when 61-year-old Ruth Monroe died of a drug overdose shortly after she moved into 1426 F Street with Puente, bringing all her earthly belongings and $6,000 in cash. Monroe was Puente's business partner in a small lunchroom business, and she'd written her husband, who was terminally ill and residing at a Veterans Administration hospital, that she was excited about the partnership and optimistic about the future. But a scant 2 weeks after she'd moved in, she ran into a friend at a beauty parlor and blurted out, "I feel like I'm going to die." When the friend asked her why, according to the reports, Monroe told the woman, "I don't know." 3 days later, Monroe was dead of a massive overdose of Tylenol and codeine. The coroner wrote it off as a self-terminating act, not having enough evidence to classify it as a homicide. A month later, however, Puente was arrested and charged with drugging 4 elderly people and stealing their valuables. One of the victims, a 74-year-old man, told the Sacramento Bee that Puente doped him, then looted his home as he watched in a stupor, unable to speak or move. A judge sentenced Puente to 5 years in the California Institution for Women at Frontera. She was released after 3 years, in 1985, and ordered to stay away from the elderly and to not handle government checks of any kind issued to others. But she'd already violated this parole condition in prison when she started corresponding with a 77-year-old pen pal from Oregon named Everson Gilmuth, who made the mistake of telling Puente he earned a cozy pension and owned an Airstream trailer. When Puente was given her walking ticket, Gilmuth was there to pick her up. He drove her to 1426 F Street, the place Puente resided before she was sent to prison. Gilmuth had told his sister he was going to marry Puente, and he'd made her a signatory on his checking account. Not long afterward, his body was dumped unceremoniously along the Sacramento River in a homemade coffin wrapped in plastic and surrounded by mothballs. 3 months after she killed Gilmuth, Puente sent a "thinking of you" card to his sister in an attempt to cover her tracks. The pensioner's body rotted in silence by the Sacramento River until January 1986, when a fisherman found his plywood coffin. His remains would remain unidentified for 3 more years in the city morgue, while his fiancée continued her killing spree. When the owner moved out of 1426 F Street, Puente took over, subletting the first-floor rooms for cheap and taking over the second story for herself. Soon, social workers came calling, seeking to place their homeless clients with her. Puente never told them about her 5 felony convictions for drugging and robbing the elderly, and they never did their homework. A former social worker told the press she put 19 seniors in Puente's care between 1987 and 1988 because Dorothea was the best the system had to offer. Peggy Nickerson said Puente accepted the hardest clients to place, the drug and alcohol addicts, the people who were physically or verbally abusive. But Nickerson stopped sending clients her way when she overheard Puente cussing out one of them. She'd later learned that 4 of her clients ended up buried in Puente's yard. The system that let these fragile members of society fall through the cracks was predictably fustigated in the wake of Puente's arrest. An independent county agency published a report titled "Sins of Omission," which criticized the Sacramento Police Department's handling of the case, as well as another 10 public and private agencies that had dealings with the boarding house. It seemed inconceivable that federal parole agents, who visited Puente 15 times during the 2 years leading up to her arrest, never realized she was running a boarding house for the elderly, in direct violation of her parole. On the second day of digging, when police let Puente walk to the nearby Clarion Hotel, ostensibly for a quick cup of coffee, she fled. She called a cab from the hotel, which took her to a bar on the other side of town. There, according to Wood, she chugged down 4 vodkas and grapefruit before catching another taxi to Stockton, where she boarded a bus to Los Angeles. During the 6-hour bus ride, she had a numbing buzz, $3,000 cash in her purse, and a burning desire to reinvent herself. A few days later, Charles Wilkes, a 59-year-old retired carpenter, was nursing a mid-afternoon beer at the Monte Carlo Tavern in downtown Los Angeles when an elegant stranger in a bright red overcoat took a stool next to him. She ordered a vodka and orange juice and introduced herself to Wilkes as Donna Johansson, a Sacramento woman whose husband had died the month before and who was looking to begin a new life in L.A. The grieving widow told Wilkes that she'd gotten off to a poor start. The cabbie who dropped her off at the $25 a night Royal Viking Motel had driven off with her suitcases, and to make matters worse, the heels of her only remaining pair of shoes, she leaned back in her bar stool to flash a bit of ankle and the purple pump at him, were broken. Wilkes felt sorry for the woman and took her shoes to a cobbler across the street to have them repaired. When he returned, the woman asked him how much money he got from Social Security a month. He didn't think her question was particularly nosy, so he told her $567 a month. He did think it strange, however, when the stranger told him she was a good cook and suggested they move in together. They were two lonely souls in the world, she said, so why not keep each other company? I've got all I can handle right now, he responded, taking another long drink of beer and changing the subject. They went for a chicken dinner at a fast food joint, and Wilkes kept wondering why the stranger seemed so familiar. In the early evening, they parted ways after making plans to go shopping the next day and replace the items the cabbie had stolen. Back at his apartment, Wilkes figured out who she was. He'd seen her on television, along with the bodies they'd pulled from her yard. A chill ran through him. He called a local TV station, which in turn called the police. I'm just very thankful that the relationship didn't go any further, Wilkes told the Times. At 10:40 p.m., Los Angeles police surrounded the Fleabag Motel where Puente was staying and arrested her without incident. During the flight back to Sacramento, she told a reporter, "I have not killed anyone. The checks I cashed, yes. I used to be a very good person at one time." Dorothea Puente wore a blue dress and pearl necklace when she pleaded innocent to the 9 counts of murder filed against her at the Sacramento Municipal Court on March 31, 1989. Another 4 years would pass before all the evidence was sifted through, and her trial began in February 1993. Because of the extensive pretrial publicity, the venue was moved from Sacramento to Monterey, and it took 3 months to impanel the jury of 8 men and 4 women. Prosecutor John O'Mara was blunt in his summation of the case. It was a simple matter of predatory greed, he said. Puente murdered her lodgers to steal their government checks. She wanted people who had no relatives, no friends, no family, people who, when they're gone, won't have others coming around and asking questions, O'Mara told the court. Her defense team, Peter Vlouten and Kevin Climo, contended that the tenants died of natural causes. Puente didn't call paramedics to retrieve the bodies, they maintained, because she was operating the boarding house in violation of her parole and didn't want to get sent back to prison. In his opening statement, Climo described Puente as a benevolent soul who selflessly cared for the dregs of society, people who had no place else to go. He argued that the money from the tenants barely covered Puente's operating expenses. She stole money to cover her expenses, he suggested, but she was not a killer. The 5-month-long trial included 153 witnesses, 3,100 pieces of evidence, and a scale model of the Victorian boarding house, which rested on a table at the front of the courtroom like a misplaced dollhouse. In the courtroom, Puente cultivated her sweet little granny look to the nines, dressing in flowered frocks and lacquering her hair into a silky white poof. She managed to keep her poker face during the most damning testimony, but dashed off frequent notes to her attorneys. When the prosecution showed photos of Puente's alleged victims, first alive and smiling, then rotting in the garden, Puente gazed at the images through her thick glasses without flinching. Dorothea Puente murdered 9 people, O'Mara told jurors after the grim photo exhibition. Don't turn your back on reason. The prosecution's main weakness was the fact that there were no eyewitnesses to the alleged murders. The prosecution could only prove the cause of death in the case of Ruth Monroe. The other bodies were too decayed. But one thing toxicology tests did reveal, however, was that there were traces of Dalmane, flurazepam, a prescription-strength sleeping pill, in all the remains. Dalmane can be lethal, especially when taken with alcohol or other sedatives, and it's particularly potent in elderly people, experts testified. At Puente's preliminary hearing, a doctor testified that Puente had used Dorothy Miller's veteran ID card to try to get a prescription for Dalmane, which the doctor refused to give her. The Dalmane evidence was backed up by testimony about boarders who complained that Puente foisted medication on them. Puente had abundant sources for the drug. In addition to the Dalmane she acquired from her court-appointed psychiatrist, she got it from 2 other doctors as well. Former resident Carol Durning, who lived at the rooming house for the first half of 1987 before she was evicted, testified that she'd overheard Puente telling James Gallup he had to leave unless he let her take charge of his money. He later complained that Puente was giving him drugs that made him sleep all the time, she added. Alvaro Bert Montoya complained to an employee of a local detox center where he resided, before transferring to 1426 F Street, that Puente was giving him a medicine he didn't like to take. When that employee, William Johnson, confronted Puente about the matter, she flew into a rage and asked him to take Montoya back to the detox center to live if he was going to meddle in her business. Johnson advised Montoya that he'd be better off at the boarding house than at the center. "I told him, 'You'll be safe here,'" Johnson told the court. "I was wrong. I've got to live with this for the rest of my life." Puente went to elaborate lengths to cover up Montoya's death. She paid Donald Anthony, a local halfway house resident, to help her flush out her story. Anthony called Montoya's social worker, posing as his brother-in-law, and told her that Montoya had gone to live with his family out of state. But in a message left on the social worker's answering machine, Anthony mistakenly used his own name instead of the brother-in-law's, the blunder which prompted Detective Cabrera's visit to the boarding house and the subsequent excavation of the yard. A handwriting expert confirmed that Puente had signed the names of 7 dead tenants on 60 federal and state checks that were sent to 1426 F Street in 1987 and 1988. She was making $5,000 a month from the forgeries. The prosecution decided not to charge Puente with forgery, saying they thought the additional charge would make the case too complex for jurors. Her defense attorney Kevin Climo conceded that Puente had a touch of larceny in her heart, but insisted that it doesn't make her a killer. It doesn't make her an evil serial killer. The prosecution brought forth witnesses to refute this argument, including the handyman Puente hired to build Everson Gilmouth's coffin. He told the court that he'd helped her dump Gilmouth's body by the Sacramento River. Authorities were not able to file charges against him because the statute of limitations on the crime had expired, but his testimony gave jurors a glimpse into Puente's frigid heart. Former residents also came forward. Homer Myers, who lived at Puente's place for 2 years after she found him in a bar, said he unwittingly dug some of the tenants' graves. Puente told him to dig a 4-foot hole for a small apricot tree, and he wondered why she'd wanted it so deep. Things got rough when he refused to sign documents empowering the mistress of the house to cash his Social Security checks. "I just never signed them," he told the paper. "I just passed it off." His refusal may have saved his life. 6 years after the bodies were discovered in Puente's yard, 6 jurors traveled to Sacramento to visit the crime scenes they'd only known from pictures or verbal descriptions during the trial. They sat in the dive bars where she trolled for victims, toured the narrow rooms of the Victorian home where several boarders were given sleeping pill cocktails before they slowly slipped from unconsciousness to death, and walked over the garden where Puente had planted flowers over their corpses. Dusk was spreading gloomily over the backyard when juror Joe Martin rushed back into the house, visibly shaken. "You can't see much back there," he told the paper, "but you feel a lot. It's weird." After a year of weighing the testimony, the jury found Puente guilty of murdering Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. But the jury couldn't reach a verdict on the 6 other murder charges, and Superior Court Judge Michael Verga declared a mistrial on those counts. There was no explanation why the jury found Puente guilty on the 3 counts, but could not reach an agreement on the other charges, which were similar. Puente showed no emotion when the verdict was read. On December 10, 1993, Verga sentenced Puente to prison for life without the possibility of parole. Puente was 64 when she was sent to Central California Women's Facility near Chowchilla, the largest women's prison in the country. She died of natural causes at Chowchilla on March 27, 2011. She was 82 years old.